is a tornado. Meteorologists tell us that the unstable air in Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. The most violent type of weather storm on planet Earth is a tornado. Meteorologists tell us that the unstable air in a thunderstorm produces updrafts and downdrafts, which interacts with the wind shear to ultimately create a tornado vortex. But many scientists acknowledge that the exact processes that cause a tornado remain mysterious. In recent Space News episodes, Thunderbolts contributor Andrew Hall has explored the electrical genesis of lightning and other earthly weather phenomena. Today, Hall offers his own thesis on the electrical genesis of tornadoes on Earth.
Previously, in Nature's Electrode, we looked at an electric Earth model for lightning genesis driven by a plasma corona formed from condensing and freezing water vapor in the central updraft of a thunderhead. We also looked at the thunderstorm itself and an electric model for the circuit that drives it in the summer thermopile. Now let's consider the most dramatic weather event of all, the tornado, and how these massively destructive whirlwinds are also formed by a plasma corona in a thunderstorm. For air to become plasma and carry current, the air has to be partially ionized. A plasma state can be defined by plasma density, the number of free electrons per unit volume, and the degree of ionization, the proportion of atoms ionized by loss or gain of an electron. A gas with as little as 1% of the particles ionized is a plasma, responding to magnetic fields and displaying high electrical conductivity. A partially ionized plasma is often referred to as a cold plasma, and highly ionized plasma is referred to as hot. Discharge from a corona is predominantly a cold, dark current invisible to the eye. Cloud to ground arcs from high charge density regions of the corona surrounding the central updraft where current from the updraft generates ions. Ground charge builds below this region in response, and the electric field strengthens, magnifying and focusing electron avalanche the way a lens focuses light into a continuous plasma channel. When the channel connects with ground and discharges a hot current, it wraps tightly in its own magnetic field, what is called a Z-band. plasma channel called a Markland convection. Rotation is a natural consequence of the circuit. Neutral air is diffused away from the Markland current, creating low pressure. But positive ions near the ground drag air, dust, and debris to the ground contact and create inflowing winds and a sudden change in direction up and around a tendril. The meeting of these opposing winds is the ground vortex. Current flow in the plasma will itself rotate, taking a helical path as it interacts with the magnetic field around it. The appearance of a tornado is precisely the expected morphology of a Markland current. Increasing current flow will spin up the tornado. It forms an inner spiraling negative current to ground and an outer spiral of positive ionic wind flowing up to the source of coronal discharge in the cloud. Because the tornado is a cold partial plasma current exchanging charge between ground and atmosphere, it can be pushed by winds to create a slanted or kinked path and travel away from its point of origin. There are several telltale signs the electric model of tornado genesis is correct. One evidence is wall clouds. Wall clouds form before a tornado in a typical storm evolution. It develops rotation, and sometimes its clouds can be seen to rise and fall in an agitated manner. Puffs of low-level clouds are drawn to it below the main cloud base. The wall cloud is a physical expression of the corona. As the corona gathers charge, it creates a lowering, vertical wall of cloud as ionization condenses moisture in the column of air below that is incongruous to the general slant motion of the storm clouds and inflowing winds. It's visual evidence of a region where the electric field is strengthening and the corona is increasing charge density prior to establishing a current to ground with a tornado. The funnel cloud doesn't always emerge from the center of the wall cloud. The funnel often appears along the edges of the wall cloud or from the surrounding clouds. This is because the region of charge density is mobile and can wander. They can also multiply, creating several tornadoes. Characteristic of parallel currents, multiple tornadoes stand off from each other as if repulsed like two parallel wires flowing current in the same direction. Rare occasions when tornadoes seem to merge, it may be that one simply dies as the other steals its current. The sudden disappearance and reappearance of tornadoes, and the reported skipping or lifting they seem to portray, are likely caused by pulsating current from an unstable coronal discharge that weakens until recombination steals the current, and then revives when the rate of ionization again overcomes the rate of recombination and a complete circuit to ground is reestablished. As discussed in Nature's Electrode and This Summer Thermopile, lightning frequency is highest around the central updraft and increases in frequency with the strength of the updraft wind. When a tornado forms, cloud-to-ground lightning frequency diminishes until the tornado dies, and then picks up again to the previous baseline. It's also found that positive lightning is more common in tornadic storms. The latter is evidence the corona in the storm's anvil that spits positive lightning is instrumental in creating the electric field strength necessary for a tornado. It amplifies the field strength affecting the negative corona in the cloud base below, creating conditions necessary for tornadoes. The fact that cloud-to-ground lightning dissipates as a tornado spins up is evidence the corona is part of a coherent electric circuit, where current in one region drops current from another. Storms that produce tornadoes are often characterized by a greenish tint in the clouds. The green tint is excused by scientists as a reflection of city lights. While their search for green-tinted city lights continues, the dim glow of a coronal discharge internal to the cloud formation explains the green tint. Luminosity in the clouds and the funnel are also reported. Consensus science blames this on misidentified sources of light, from lightning, city lights, or flashes from ground power lines. Some of it, no doubt, is, but some of it is likely the effect of coronal discharge. Lightning flashes don't make a continuous glow. Ionized oxygen can recombine to produce ozone, which has a distinctive chlorine-like gassy smell. This smell is often reported by witnesses. So are hissing sounds from the base of the funnel. Funnel clouds and small tornadoes are known to produce harmonic sounds of whistling, whining, humming, or buzzing bees. As ozone is liberated, it produces such a hissing sound. Energized transmission lines, subject to overvoltage conditions, produce all of these same effects. Faint luminescent glow, ozone production, and its accompanying hiss and smell. The cause is coronal discharge. Tornadoes also produce identifiable infrasound. It's inaudible to the human ear, but it can be felt. It will produce nausea, agitation, and body heat. Effects often felt in the presence of tornadoes, although fear might do that too. Lightning has been reported internal to the funnel. These may be a form of cloud-to-cloud discharge between the counterflowing positive and negative currents in the Markman convection. Tornadoes are seen to have an inner and outer column, although this is disputed by consensus scientists as an illusion. The inner column, however, is seen if the outer dusty sheath dissipates or is blown away. This is consistent with the double wall formation in a Markman convection. Tornadoes emit on the electromagnetic spectrum as measured by researchers. Tornadoes emit spherics, which is the same type of broadband radio noise lightning discharges produce. So what if there is no supercell? How do all other vortex phenomena form, like land spouts and water spouts, gustnadoes and dust devils? And how are they related? Well, by the same mechanism proposed here for the supercell tornado, only in lower energy form. Funnel clouds, which never result in a touchdown, are a tendril of Markman convection current that begins to recombine faster than it generates ions, and it dies. Land spouts, gustnadoes, and water spouts all begin with a surface disturbance, a vortex without a cloud, or at least not one showing a wall cloud or rotation. These are instances of stronger ionic accumulation at ground level, creating a strong ground vortex first in easily ionized sand or water, whereas the corona above is still weak and diffuse. This comports with observations of twisters of all kinds, including dust devils and spouts, which are seen to begin on the ground, or water in the case of a water spout, where documented evolution begins with a mysterious dark spot on the water. Thunderstorms, lightning, and tornadoes, all products of the same weather event, can be perfectly modeled electrically. Electromagnetic fields, ionization, current, capacitance, and induction rule nature. It is evident in nature's every aspect because the fractal self-same patterns always appear. Consensus science adheres to a gravity model that ignores this fundamental causation and instead feverishly dissects the emergent thermodynamic and fluid dynamic interactions looking for answers. Like trying to tell time by taking apart the clock, they continually come up short as a result. Thank you.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
Check the description box. I'll list all of that. So you can get some documents. I put all the I saw it. Nice.
The theme is Future Science, and this will be our 6th annual conference, August 17th to 20th in Phoenix, Arizona. Perhaps you already know that the electric universe paradigm is gaining greater traction year by year. Who could deny today that the vastness of space is animated by a lifelike sea of charged particles called plasma? Well, the plasma universe is an electric universe, and that's a far cry from the electrically sterile cosmos of standard theory throughout the 20th century. Plasma. When we speak of future science, we mean science minus the fiction. No Big Bang, no dark matter, no black hole singularities, no neutron stars, no thermonuclear core of the sun, no planets on clockwork orbits for billions of years, and few, if any, dirty snowball comets. The electric universe movement is a reconsideration of fundamentals in the sciences. Independent research has converged on a series of electrical findings. The confidence driving this movement comes from the demonstrable power of the electric force acting on planetary, stellar, and galactic evolution. No subatomic domain and no corner of the remote universe is free from this influence. The electric force, the long overlooked underpinning of the natural world. EU 2017 will include a roster of experts on naturally occurring electrical phenomena. Our first recommendation to you is don't be late. The first highlight will be a talk by the internationally recognized expert on electrified water, Dr. Gerald Pollack. Dr. Pollack will report on the surprising role of separated charge in the organization of global weather systems. Then will come our conference keynote speaker, Dr. James Ryder. Before his retirement in 2011, Dr. Ryder served as Vice President of Lockheed Martin and as head of the company's Advanced Technology Center. Dr. Ryder is currently chairman of the board of the International Science Foundation, which funds the Sapphire Project and advises on scientific aspects of the experiment. Dr. Ryder's update will help to set the tone of the conference, in particular the anticipated report on Sapphire by Project Director Monty Childs. Our Chief Science Advisor, Wal Thornhill, will outline a vision for the future. Science incrementally discovering, one surprise at a time, the electric universe. And retired professor of electrical engineering, Donald Scott, will review recent findings that now confirm the presence of Birkeland currents in space. The environment through which the Earth itself moves is not electrically neutral. Add to this electrified mix the contribution of Ben Davidson, founder of the Suspicious Observers Group. Ben will speak on the interdisciplinary implications of the electrical paradigm, ranging across such diverse fields as space science, earthquake prediction, biomedical engineering, and new energy prospects. Of special interest, we'll also be devoting a full day to the Immanuel Velikovsky controversy, one of the most critical scientific debates of the 20th century. Suppression of Velikovsky's work continued for decades, and the core issues raised still haunt scientific discourse today. Contributors to this discussion will include the people closest to the controversy in recent years. More than 15 additional experts will be contributing as speakers and panelists. Key themes will include the electricity of life, electrical scars of planetary violence, and the impact of planetary catastrophe on the ancient civilizations. We invite you to join us in this 3.5-day exploration of the electric universe. That's EU 2017 in Phoenix, Arizona, August 17th to 20th.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. On August 17, 2017, the Thunderbolts Project will begin its international conference, Future Science, in Phoenix, Arizona. At the conference, speakers from a variety of disciplines, including engineering, physics, mathematics, and the life sciences will present new, groundbreaking research on the role of electricity in nature. A keynote speaker will be Professor Donald Scott, who has spent recent years developing his own model of the structure of a Birkeland current. As noted in several Space News episodes, in recent years, the term Birkeland current has increasingly appeared in scientific literature, with scientists recognizing the role the currents play in earthly auroras and other atmospheric phenomena. Recently, Dr. Scott's prediction that the unique signature of Birkeland currents is their counter-rotation has been visually verified. At the Thunderbolts conference, Dr. Scott will discuss his investigation into the role of cosmic Birkeland currents and the evidence that these currents power many galaxies in deep space.
We in the electric universe are involved in the investigation of things that happened very long ago or far, far away. And one of the challenging things about that is trying to get any kind of hard, substantive evidence to support your ideas. And hopefully we can come up with, at least we always look for, evidence that interlocks with other evidence. Anyway, we've long suspected that electrical currents flow through cosmic space and they have real effects on things that we can observe. For example, Christian Birkeland predicted that the cause of the Earth's auroras were electric currents. He was right. And now we can call them Birkeland currents in his honor. They are there. They flow down into the north and south poles of Earth, and they've been measured, and they're now known to exist. Nobody really argues about that anymore. We've suspected that if it was true about the Earth, though, it might be true about other planets as well. So how can we obtain supporting evidence for that, other than maybe going there and measuring them with a space probe? Well, a couple of years ago, I was able to develop a mathematical model for what the structure of a Birkeland current would probably look like if we could actually see one and take it apart and dissect it. Actually, Birkeland currents have a unique structure, totally unique. They consist of a collection of concentric cylinders that counter-rotate, like a bunch of pipes inside one another, each one going in the opposite direction from the ones on either side of it. Or I shouldn't say either side of it, but inside it or outside of it. Anyway, each cylinder, one inside the other, rotates in the opposite direction from its neighbor. So when I saw that the north poles of both Saturn and Jupiter are covered with counter-rotating cloud belts, now that was the kind of corroboration that's hard to ignore. Counter-rotation is almost uniquely a property of Birkeland currents. Doesn't mean it can't happen from other means, but it's very, very difficult. Try to think of it yourself. How do you make these cylinders go in the opposite directions? That's very tough. That's a tough problem. So when we see it, we're encouraged to think that we may be seeing a situation in which Birkeland currents are present, or at least we should allow for the possibility that that's what's going on. The Earth's auroras exhibit counter-rotation, and so that's additional supporting evidence that indeed, yes, Birkeland currents are impinging on the North Pole and South Pole of the Earth. So why not on Saturn, Jupiter, and the other planets? We see these counter-rotating cloud belts, and that supports our ideas. So we also think, however, that streams of Birkeland currents connect galaxies in our universe. If we can show that lots of these galaxies contain counter-rotating belts of stars, that would be strong evidence for the presence of Birkeland currents. Otherwise, how do you get those belts of stars to go in opposite directions? In this summer's EU conference, I'm going to present evidence of a lot of galactic counter-rotation. That astronomers claim that this is very rare, that very few galaxies exhibit this. Well, maybe, but it's quite difficult to observe and measure, and I will try to show the folks at the conference how that's done. Does that prove that that Birkeland currents are responsible for galactic rotation? No, of course not. But it's very difficult to come up with another mechanism that can produce galaxy counter-rotation that isn't electrical, that isn't a Birkeland current. Anyway, lastly, at a conference, sort of talking about the other end of the spectrum of dimension, from the huge galaxies to something very small on the other end, relatively small at least. We suspect that storms here on Earth may involve Birkeland currents. And I'm going to be presenting new evidence that they indeed are. They're intimately involved with both hurricanes and tornadoes. Also, this last week, I discovered, thanks to my informants who say, hey, Don, you should see this. And so a fellow sent me a website showing that Birkeland currents are a possible explanation of the mysterious circulating ocean currents, like, for instance, the Gulf Stream. People have been asking for decades, centuries, actually millennia, as to why do these big streams, these oceanic rivers of water flow around and around and around. What drives them? You can hear people talk about dynamos inside the Earth or something, but that's like the dog ate my homework kind of explanation. They are, we think, now quite obviously the result of those Birkeland currents that come into the poles of the Earth. And I will be talking about that and presenting evidence to that effect in August, and I look forward to it.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
Dynamos inside the Earth or something, but that's like the dog ate my homework kind of explanation. They are, we think, now currents are a possible explanation of the mysterious circulating ocean currents, like, for instance, the Gulf Stream. People have been asking for decades, centuries, actually millennia, as to why do these big streams, these oceanic rivers of water flow around and around and around. What drives them? It's the Gulf Stream. People have been asking for decades, centuries, actually millennia, as to why do these big streams, these oceanic rivers of water flow around and around and around. What drives them? You can hear people talk about dynamos inside the Earth or something, but that's like the dog ate my homework kind of explanation. They are, we think, now quite obviously the result of those Birkeland currents that come into the poles of the Earth. And I will be talking about that. My informants who say, hey, Don, ocean currents, like, for instance, the Gulf Stream. People have been asking for decades, centuries, actually millennia, as to why do these big streams, these oceanic rivers of water flow around and around and around. What drives them?
Counter-rotating concentric cylinders.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Scientists working on NASA's historic Juno mission to the gas giant Jupiter have recently presented their early findings for the first time. Like so many other recent space missions, what they have discovered is not what they expected. As reported by newscientist.com, the findings are already challenging assumptions about everything from the planet's atmosphere to its interior. One of the biggest surprises is the enormous strength of Jupiter's magnetic field, even more powerful and, quote, much more irregular than scientists expected, challenging long-held beliefs about the so-called dynamo inside of Jupiter that is thought to produce its magnetic field. As principal investigator Scott Bolton stated, I didn't expect all the theories to be wrong, but there's motion going on in the planet we did not anticipate. In part one of this two-part presentation, physicist and chief science advisor to the Thunderbolts Project, Wal Thornhill, begins his in-depth analysis of the Juno data, including the many victories that already seem evident for the electric universe theory.
On May 25th, NASA held a media teleconference on the first science from Juno at Jupiter. Sadly, the science used old beliefs to interpret data that conflicted with those beliefs. The result is that Jupiter up close looks nothing like the once upon a time, billions of years ago, stories we have been told. Not one model of the interior of Jupiter survived Juno's close encounter with the planet, except for the electric universe model. So here's an electric universe analysis of the material presented at the teleconference. Scott Bolton, Juno principal investigator, began by noting how different Jupiter looks from what we expected. He said, Juno is, in effect, looking inside Jupiter. Jupiter was thought to be boring and uniform inside. Anywhere you looked, it would all look the same. What we're finding is anything but that. It's very different, very complex. The North Pole of Jupiter has incredibly complex features, cyclones and anticyclones all over the poles that weren't expected. If anyone had shown you a photo like this a few years ago, they wouldn't recognize it as Jupiter. Also, the North and South Poles don't really look like each other, which is also a puzzle to scientists. Are the cyclones stable, or will they last like the Great Red Spot, which has lasted 300 years at least? Or is this something that's dynamic? A Cambridge University textbook says that Jupiter, with its mass of 300 Earths, is composed mostly of hydrogen and helium, with a heavy element core of roughly 10 Earth masses. Being so far from the Sun, it was expected that solar heating would play little part in Jupiter's atmospheric motion, so that it should be boring and uniform inside. So there's an unexplained energy source driving the numerous giant cyclones at the poles of Jupiter and the ammonia plume at the equator that has not been factored into settled planetary science. But 23 years ago, there was a natural probe of Jupiter's atmosphere that exposed that energy source. It was the Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet fragment encounters with Jupiter during the week of 16 to 22nd of July 1994. Notice I didn't say impacts. There are many problems with the settled science of that event. So it's good policy to return to the earliest reports of those events because of the human tendency to forget, rationalize, or ignore evidence that doesn't fit our beliefs. Some astronomers predicted that the comet fragments were too small to have much effect when they hit Jupiter. There's a chance we will see very little, said the late Eugene Shoemaker, co-discoverer of the comet, shortly before the event. Shoemaker-Levy 9 couldn't even be found in images taken before the comet broke up on its first brush with Jupiter. Astronomer Brian Marsden thought it was only 1 to 2 kilometers in diameter. It's going to be tough to see much, he concluded. I don't think there's going to be a very large explosion. So the eventual dazzling display baffled astronomers. Ultraviolet images showed glowing streaks in Jupiter's northern hemisphere, which appeared as almost mirror images of glows from the impact site of fragment G in the southern hemisphere. The Jovian auroral displays appeared to be triggered by electrically charged particles released during the impacts in the south, following a looping arc northward along the planet's magnetic field until they fell back into the planet's atmosphere, creating a glow in the north. After a year's analysis by hundreds of talented scientists, Nature issued the following statement. First seen was a faint glow that slowly increased in brightness on a timescale of tens of seconds, believed to be due to a large number of small meteors in the coma surrounding each Shoemaker-Levy 9 fragment. The meteor shower was followed by a sharp increase in brightness as the main part of the fragment entered the Jovian atmosphere. A few tens of seconds later, a fireball exploded up the chimney created in the atmosphere by the bolide. Forget the ad hoc meteor shower. Electrically charged comet fragments would be expected to exhibit a brightening cometary coma as they approach Jupiter, just as comets do on approaching the electric sun. The glow increases until a sudden arc discharge occurs between the comet fragment and the charged body of Jupiter. The same effect is often seen when a sun-grazing comet causes a coronal mass ejection from the sun. The steep increase in brightness that astronomers observed was more like a lightning flash than the light curve of a bright bolide's entry into the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, it was expected that the fragments would flare several times like those fireballs. That didn't happen. That idea and the fireball exploding up a chimney from the clouds below are simply assumptions of the mechanical impact model. And there were many other anomalies for the impact model. As we shall see, there is no evidence that the comet fragments got down to the clouds intact. In Jupiter's plasma environment, we can expect electrical forces to affect the trajectories of the charged comet fragments. Such forces would cause deviations from the expected impact times. And in fact, impact times were on average 8 minutes later than expected. One of the largest pieces, fragment G, showed spectral evidence of magnesium when it was just 10 hours from impact. Such metals only show up when comets graze around the Sun. But whatever was tearing magnesium from the fragment as it sped in through Jupiter's magnetosphere couldn't drive off enough water to be detectable. That failure to observe water gave rise to questioning whether the comet might be an asteroid. After all, only the fuzziness of Shoemaker-Levy 9 identified it as a comet, and some asteroids have been observed occasionally to show fuzziness. The electrical comet model explains each and every mystery of Shoemaker-Levy 9. An electric comet is as dry as an asteroid. The fuzziness of a comet is due to the electrical coronal glow of its enveloping plasma sheath. When the electrical stress at the comet's surface increases beyond a threshold, arcs will appear at the surface which sputter atoms such as magnesium from the minerals there. That this should occur shortly before the collision is not surprising. Jupiter's magnetosphere is the most active electrical environment for a comet, other than a close encounter with the Sun. The Galileo spacecraft on its way to Jupiter, the Hubble Space Telescope, and many terrestrial observatories tracked the fragments as they approached Jupiter. Their data highlighted another mystery. Some collisions that were calculated to occur just beyond Jupiter's limb, and that should have been invisible to all but the Galileo spacecraft, were seen from the Earth. In a NASA news report, Dr. Andrew Ingersoll said, "In effect, we are apparently seeing something we didn't think we had any right to see." Dr. Torrance Johnson of JPL commented, "It seems clear that something was happening high enough to be seen beyond the curve of the planet." The predictable electrical event high in Jupiter's ionosphere prior to the fragments striking the upper atmosphere did indeed occur. What then were the vertical jets seen rising 3,000 kilometres above Jupiter's clouds and known as plumes? And what were the crescent-shaped dark features that resulted from the fallback of the plume onto the atmosphere? The dark material came to be known technically as the brown stuff, its nature unknown. The geophysicist and expert on impact cratering, Dr. J. Melosh, suggested that the comet fragments would penetrate Jupiter's atmosphere so deeply before exploding that they would be swallowed up and we would see very little. Others proposed that each fragment would dig a tunnel of fire in Jupiter's atmosphere before exploding and sending a plume of hot atmospheric and cometary material from the top of the tunnel into space. This was the plume model that was explored to try to explain the strange, dark fallout pattern. However, the plume model could not explain the clear zone between the dark core and the crescent, nor could it explain the radial lines dissecting the crescent. All of the unexplained oddities began to make sense if a plasma discharge occurred between the highly charged comet fragments and Jupiter's ionosphere. That's why the light from fragments that were expected to impact beyond the limb was unexpectedly visible. The light from a discharge beyond Jupiter's limb but 3,000 kilometres above Jupiter's cloud tops would have been visible from Earth. The electrical nature of the event also explains why comet fragments of different sizes created flashes at the same height. The discharges occurred as each charged fragment hit Jupiter's ionosphere, or electrical plasma sheath, well above the atmosphere. The comet fragments were destroyed like exploding capacitors before reaching the atmosphere. Those ionospheric discharges would have triggered an upward discharge from the atmosphere below. In the very low pressure of space, it would have been in the form of a compact plasmoid. Evidence for this interpretation is the observation that the so-called plumes continued to radiate at the shortest wavelengths, which is not to be expected from a rising hot gaseous plume as it expands and cools. Additional evidence for a powerful plasma discharge came from the fallout material, the brown stuff. The Hubble Space Telescope found most surprising were the strong signatures from sulfur-bearing compounds like diatomic sulfur or disulfur. Disulfur is a molecule with a very short lifetime, and its origin is one of the great mysteries of comet chemistry. However, if we turn to the only known natural source, Jupiter's innermost Galilean moon, Io, Gaseous disulfur has been detected emanating from the vicinity of Pele volcano. Plasma scientists, following a suggestion from Professor Tommy Gold, recognized the so-called volcanoes on Io as an electrical exchange with Jupiter, producing umbrella-shaped plasma gun discharge plumes, which have dusted the moon with colorful sulfur molecules, including red and brown variants in circular electromagnetic fallout patterns. Now, a large quantity of oxygen was observed in the Shoemaker-Levy 9 events at Jupiter. So it seems that a powerful plasma discharge is capable of fusing two oxygen atoms to produce a sulfur atom, which then combine to form the colorful molecular sulfur variants, including the short-lived disulfur molecule. This also means that Io was originally an icy moon like its Galilean siblings, but has had the oxygen in its ice progressively converted to the observed global dusting of yellow sulfur. This is currently the only proposal to simply explain this oddity of Io. It may be that children listening on their school's radio telescope provided the most significant observation of all. They said that the Shoemaker-Levy 9 collisions were accompanied by bursts of radio emission, just like those from sunspot activity on the Sun. New scientists call this Jupiter's surprise radio broadcast. Never in 23 years of Jupiter observations have we seen such a rapid and intense increase in radio emission, said Michael Klein of JPL. The radio emission peaked on the 23rd of July, just after the last comet fragment hit, and it declined thereafter. Klein had expected dust from the comet to absorb electrons, which otherwise might contribute to radio emissions. Instead, extra electrons were supplied by a source which, as yet, is a mystery. But it's no mystery. Like all comets, Shoemaker-Levy 9 was negatively charged, its fragments supplying copious electrons for the radio emissions. The fate of Shoemaker-Levy 9 thus provides a consistent picture of the electrical nature of comets and Jupiter. Leading plasma physicist Hans Alfvén drew the Sun's electrical circuit, showing the planets orbiting in its equatorial current sheet, known incorrectly to astrophysicists as the solar wind. So it's electrical energy from the Sun's circuit that drives the weather on planets with atmospheres, like Jupiter. The cyclones and anticyclones at the poles are the footprints of twisting Birkeland currents following Jupiter's magnetic field into the polar regions. As a result, Jupiter's magnetic field is more complex than expected in those regions. Fran Bagenal, a planetary scientist at the University of Colorado, Boulder, said, "Rather than having one big wire carrying all the current, you've got multiple little wires all spread out." This scattered pattern means that the structure and origin of Jupiter's northern and southern lights are more complicated than previously thought, because the electrically charged particles that produce them are flowing along a variety of paths. On further inspection, we should see evidence of the unique signatures of Birkeland currents in the features of Jupiter's poles. We can learn more about Jupiter's electrical features by re-examining Christian Birkeland's experiments, published in 1908, than all of the modern computer modelling based on invalid concepts. All you will hear from experts are answers to questions they pose for themselves, but their narrow expertise doesn't fit them to answer questions outside their training. That's why paradigm shifts are so tough. Meanwhile, stay tuned to find out what's really beneath the clouds of Jupiter and its great red spot.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
entered the theater of an alien sky. If the words and images seem strange to you, there's a reason for this. Our world was once a vastly different place. To experience this won't hurt you, and there is nothing to fear. Throughout this video series, we've claimed that the origins of world mythology, ancient symbolism, and magical rites lie in human memories of extraordinary natural events. It was from the emerging commemorative practices that the ancient civilizations themselves arose. And so we've repeatedly emphasized that the reconstruction offered here is far too specific to allow us to make up stories or to make up explanations. The evidence will either be there in the unique detail that the reconstruction demands, or it will not be there.
Hey, what's up, Delete? Can I get a citation to that?
Our explanation lies in a congregation of planets gathered close to the Earth long before the rise of observational astronomy. And that means before any of these bodies were even named as planets. We've called this celestial formation the polar configuration, and we've identified many of its varying forms as electric discharge activity between these bodies. Extraordinary events in the sky provoked an explosion of human imagination, now discoverable as story content within every ancient culture. In the course of these presentations, it should also become clear that no archetype, no global theme could ever be explained by natural events in our own time. Things occurring today provide no reference whatsoever. The impact of this human experience requires that we follow the instincts of a detective, noting things too consistently out of place. And we must never forget that the more unusual the detail, the more compelling is the improbable convergence of testimony. Our claim is that the link of the mythic archetypes to the evolution of the polar configuration requires that we uncover the concrete reference beneath the imaginative symbols. Amongst the cross-cultural points of agreement is the repeated identity of the mother goddess as the planet Venus. This identity is not just worth following, it is a window to a mind-altering human experience, a story that reverberated through history for thousands of years. The paradoxical identity of the mother goddess with life itself, her role as the great protectress, but also as a world destroyer, can only be explained at the level of concrete origins beneath that symbolism. The discharged streamers of Venus, an effusion of mythic power and glory, were the animating life of heaven, seen in mythic terms as the luminous heart and soul of the universal power we've identified as Saturn. But the connection runs in two directions, since the discharging sphere of Venus was also interpreted as the protective shield of the warrior god named as Mars, who occupied the impenetrable spot, as if protected from the sky-darkening clouds or celestial armies of chaos. When the heavens fell into disorder, the sky itself became a mythic battlefield. Swarms of debris, seen as rebelling hordes, appeared to overtake the world. It was in this context that the most active and spectacular form of the goddess emerged, affecting every ancient culture's ideas about the meaning of war, conquest, and magical defense. But was the goddess a divine weapon launched against rebelling powers, or was she herself the provocation, the feared destroyer of cosmic order? Human imagination would stand in competition for millennia, but more fundamental than the interpretation was the underlying event. And our purpose here is to see the events through the lens of global patterns. Ironically, it is the competing interpretations that confirm both the patterns and the events that provoked them. Confirmation comes wherever, without the underlying event, the global patterns would not be conceivable, not even be possible. In the presence of the goddess's visible power, enemies were scattered. Dark clouds of chaos gave way to a blast of fire and light. The rebelling hordes of heaven fled from its onslaught. One of the most dramatic illustrations of this archetypal theme is the Egyptian legend called the destruction of mankind. The myth says that the primeval sun god Ra had grown aged and perhaps a bit weary of humanity. It recounts how in that remote time the children of Ra had rebelled against the god. In response to the rebellion, Ra sent out his powerful eye to take vengeance on a disrespectful world. The agent of the conflagration that followed was the goddess Sekhmet. Not just a goddess, Sekhmet was the far-famed eye of Ra, the Utchit, the giver of life and the great protectress, the very heart and soul of the primeval sun himself.
PFT, right?
Enigmatically, Sekhmet also possessed both a leonine and a serpentine form, a remarkable parallel to the Sumerian Venus goddess Inanna, who displayed the same forms in her role as the terrifying radiance in the center of the god On, the overarching ruler of the sky. This is no coincidence. These mythic forms reveal no relationship whatsoever to today's sky, but they are not accidental, not random, and they direct our attention to the archetype of the great comet, the human experience from which the female comet archetype descended. The comet is the eye, heart, and soul of a great king. Comet is a star with disordered hair or leonine mane. Comet is a cosmic serpent. And the comet as a sign or an agent of world destruction. And so we find a remarkable juxtaposition of comet attributes in the titles of the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, called the beautiful eye of the primeval sun. She was the great flame, or flaming one, the destroyer by fire, the destroyer of rebellions, the ruler of serpents, and the ruler of lions. Strangely, all of the well-documented goddesses in Egypt were, like Sekhmet, called the Eye of Ra, suggesting an underlying identity entirely outside natural experience today. And no goddess figure in ancient Egypt tells this story of the sun god's eye more vividly than Sekhmet, whose very name derives from the root kim, signifying a blast of glory or majesty, the essential character of the eye goddess. Sekhmet entered the conflagration displaying a trail of fire. The texts say, "Behold me, men and gods, I have come into being as the Lady of Glorious Appearings. My flame is behind me." It is a flame which drives away on its account. The tip of its flame crosses the land from the sky. No one at all can approach her. The streams behind her are flames of fire. In fact, the Egyptian traditions constitute a remarkable parallel to Sumerian descriptions of a world in fear and trembling at the tempestuous radiance of Inanna.
They didn't recognize that they were already taken care of.
In precisely the same way, Sekhmet appeared as a flame of fire in her tempest, instilling terror on earth and threatening to destroy the world.
As you can remember, Tim Osman goes on.
I am mistress of the flame, the goddess announces.
Truth Undenied's channel.
The fear of me is in their hearts, and the awe of me is in their hearts. The flame makes his enemies fall. It is a flame moving before the wind of the sky to the end of the earth. Surely it is no coincidence that the great flame in heaven, taking the form of a fiery serpent, found its symbolic place on the crown of kings in Egypt, exactly as we've seen in ancient Mesopotamia. It was the headgear of the king that reflected the protective role of the explosive majesty most dramatically. In later times, when Egyptian armies confronted foreign nations,
A friend of mine
these peoples
passed me
were
a
seen
screen
as
capture.
barbarians
They're all over there.
outside the gate.
Well, yeah, I
They were
had a
the
great time
terrestrial
getting Rim the other
counterpart
night.
of the
Friends of
primeval
Tim and
chaos
Tim
fiends.
Osmond.
And so
fucking,
the king invariably
wasn't him that
called
said it,
upon
but
the
it was
shining
that,
majesty of Ra, remembering
Fucking
how
hell
the
shit.
eye goddess
So,
in her rage had
I'm just, like,
destroyed
playing little games and
rebelling
shit.
powers in
Didn't
the
get
sky
Grim.
in former times.
Said a whole bunch of
And
irrational
considering
bullshit.
this
Didn't make
theme,
any
the
sense.
critical
Made a bunch of
steps would
shit up.
require comparative
Brought
analysis
ad-hom to the
of
conversation
an
and never brought any of the
incontrovertible
facts. Never
historical
mentioned any
pattern.
of the stuff we're talking about.
The ancient story of the goddess
Correct.
as the explosive
Making
glory
sense.
of heaven was the story of the great comet. In this experience, we find the origins of the astronomical language and symbolism of comets around the world. There is no other explanation.
Sorry.
And so, too, the attributes of the celestial glory are the defining attributes of the planet Venus as Mother Goddess. And as we continue our series, this truth can be verified in the astronomical lexicon of every
Probably better than you don't hear that anyway.
Times.
Just a bunch of random
In
bullshit.
very central details, the global story of the great comet is the story of the planet Venus.
But I was saying, Tim Osmond didn't destroy Flat Earth. Flat Earth was destroyed before it ever presented itself. It made no sense. It always was beaten. There was no argument. It's like, you know, the first minute that it came out, I made, I said, all the best arguments that are still the ones that are still existing right now that they can't be beat. So, like the moment that it came out, it didn't matter. It's not our fault that they didn't recognize that they were beaten. It's just the matter of the truth. You're beaten. It's the truth. Believe it or not, doesn't matter. It's obvious. You guys got manipulated into believing into a flat earth bullshit with the Travis Stock Institute and all the think tank bullshit, Freemasonry, fuck arounds, and it's got nothing to do with reality. So took that shit all apart in the beginning. So yeah, the reason I don't want to, I'm not saying put all your eggs in somebody's basket who comes along and says that he's the, you know what I mean? No, sorry, not any one person debunked the flat earthers. It's just that the flat earthers are starting to finally realize that the stuff that the guys have been telling them since the very beginning is still true. You know, they forgot who they spoke to in the beginning, it seems like, right? It always goes down like that.
From the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts
It's like
Project
Einstein coming up with everyone else's theory because he's more popular. That's not what happened.
For many decades, the standard cosmological model has stated that the universe began many billions of years ago with a primordial explosion called the Big Bang. Beginning from an unimaginably hot, dense point.
So what I was trying to say is he's over there on that Truth Undenied channel fucking around,
the physical expansion of the universe is
while that dude is sitting there slandering and fucking with me and the research that I do and acting like it's all a bunch of big fat jokes and stuff, when he can't argue any of it. He has no fucking ability to argue any of the things that we talk about. So he has no clue as to which, what things he's talking about in the first place. He's just going to tell everybody, oh no, a bunch of bullshit about things that they're not even true. It's just I'm not even going to repeat them because they're not true. It doesn't, it's retarded.
That challenge the very underpinnings
making up lies. I mean, what's the agenda there to just talk about somebody and say all kind of dumb shit? You know,
any object
I don't get that.
in the Big Bang universe.
Yeah, and then
so-called ancient stars whose chemical composition is completely wrong if they formed from material in the early universe. To grand design galaxies that display a complexity of form that defy their theoretical age, to evidence that the so-called expansion of the universe is accelerating at an impossibly fast rate, even accounting for dark energy's influence. Many scientists have acknowledged the major problems these discoveries pose for Big Bang cosmology. Nevertheless, consensus scientific opinion remains that the Big Bang is the best current theory for the origins of our universe. Indeed, a recent Scientific American article aroused a response from some of the world's most revered cosmologists that demonstrates just how slow and difficult is real change in the culture of science. The article in question, entitled Cosmic Inflation Theory Faces Challenges, proposed that the universe began with a so-called Big Bounce instead of a Big Bang.
That's right, and I've given him ample opportunities to come talk with me about anything. If he said, oh, he wanted to talk about some stuff, and so I've been trying to contact him ever since, and it's just like I get ignored. So it's not as if he really wants to talk about some stuff.
That's obvious.
Big Bang,
then this all bullshit goes down. So I'm not even into it.
They
I can see that these motherfuckers are fake.
The Planck data disfavored the simplest inflation models and exacerbated long-standing foundational problems with the theory, providing new reasons to consider competing ideas about the origin and evolution of the universe. Yet even now, the cosmology community has not taken a cold, honest look at the Big Bang inflationary theory, or paid significant attention to critics who question whether inflation happened. In a response letter to the controversial article, 33 scientists, including physicist Stephen Hawking, begin with a statement: "There is no disputing the fact that inflation has become the dominant paradigm in cosmology." They then accused the authors of, quote, dismissing the research of not only all the authors of this letter, but also that of a substantial contingent of the scientific community. However, the problems for Big Bang cosmology reach far beyond anything that Hawking and his colleagues seem ready to acknowledge. On the question of the so-called cosmic microwave background, or CMB, the conclusion that the radiation is a, quote, background at all begins with the assumption of a Big Bang. But as previously discussed on this series, ample evidence exists to consider that the, quote, asymmetric radiation is in fact a locally produced foreground. As physicist Wal Thornhill has explained, proponents of the electric universe and plasma cosmology argue that the radiation is due to microwave radiation from the filamentary galactic electric currents flowing in the neighborhood of the sun. In fact, some of the expected structures, a galaxy-wide sample of dense filamentary structures correlated with spiral arms and star formation, have been recently mapped. The image on your screen is an example of a net.
I mean, I don't think anybody really even knows about him or whatever, but I mean, pro-GMO, you know, pro-church, pro-fucking vaccine, you know, probably wants a wall, probably pro-wall, you know, pro-Trump. Now I'm speculating, but I'm not sure. I really don't know, but I'm just saying this kind of dumb shit. Just pro-greasy face, pro-not washing your hair. It's all that. Pro-nastiness.
Network of galactic filaments. As Thornhill notes, we see a roughly orthogonal branching of tributaries, which is characteristic of an electrical discharge. This principle is seen in this comparison with experimental discharge filaments. If the CMB is in fact what physicist Eric Lerner has described as a, quote, radiofog of dense plasma filaments, its presence tells us nothing about the age of the universe. The local origins of the radiation would also help explain the seemingly baffling discovery of apparently vast and remote cosmic voids. The appearance of a cold spot, where the, quote, temperature of an area of space is interpreted as significantly lower than the surrounding region, suggests the presence of a void where many galaxies should be observed. The interpretation of the size of the so-called void is based on the assumption that the redshift of the surrounding galaxies provides an accurate measure of the object's size and distance. In recent years, some scientists have offered the incredible speculation that such a void is actually the imprint of a parallel universe. In fact, the concept of parallel universes, or the multiverse, is a theory championed by the aforementioned Stephen Hawking, as well as Brian Greene, Michio Kaku, and the current host of the television show Cosmos, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Ironically, at the time that cosmologist Carl Sagan wrote his iconic book, Cosmos, challenges to the very foundations of the Big Bang were still permitted. On the question of whether the Doppler interpretation of galactic redshift is a reliable indicator of an expanding universe, Sagan wrote, "There is nevertheless a nagging suspicion among some astronomers that all may not be right with the deduction from the redshift of galaxies via the Doppler effect that the universe is expanding. The astronomer Halton Arp has found enigmatic and disturbing cases where a galaxy and a quasar, or a pair of galaxies that are in apparent physical association, have very different redshifts." Sagan continues, "If Arp is right, the exotic mechanisms proposed to explain the energy source of distant quasars, supernova chain reactions, supermassive black holes, and the like, would prove unnecessary. Quasars need not then be very distant, but some other exotic mechanism will be required to explain the redshift. In either case, something very strange is going on in the depths of space. At the other end of the spectrum from so-called vast cosmic voids are objects that appear impossibly huge. One such object, the quasar cluster huge LQG, is supposedly so enormous it would comprise about 5% of the visible universe. As one astronomer said of the discovery, it, quote, upsets the foundation of everything we do. The force of gravity is weak and takes time to move things around. The elapsed time since the conjectured Big Bang sets a limit on how big any structure can be. Structures exceeding that limit are, by the cosmologists' own admission, impossible. One possible solution to this enigma is that the objects simply are not as distant and huge as they appear, based on their measured redshift. Halton R. proposed that the redshift of quasars depends not only on a velocity value, but also its, quote, intrinsic redshift. This would be a property of matter that is subject to change over time. ARP found that the intrinsic redshift of a quasar or galaxy took discrete values, which decreased with the distance from a central active galaxy. In ARP's hypothesis, many mature galaxies of a specific type eject newborn objects, called QSOs, or quasars, and these objects grow up to be companion galaxies of their parents. As they move away from the parent, their mass and brilliance changes. Their velocity slows, and they tend to begin to fall back toward the parent galaxy. Proponents of the electric universe, including physicist and chief science advisor to the Thunderbolts Project, Wal Thornhill, agree with ARP's thesis of quasar ejection. However, Thornhill disagrees with ARP's description of the mass of quasars increasing with time. ARP proposed that the existence of a new quasar becomes recognized by matter in the rest of the universe at the speed of light. But in Thornhill's view, an initially positively charged quasar is followed by a beam of electrons from its parent galaxy, which would explain both the quantized redshift and increase in mass. These electrons may come in bursts, like the quasar ejections themselves, which, if true, would predict and explain seemingly impossibly sudden changes in quasars. As we reported last year on this series, many recently discovered objects in space lend great credence to this thesis. A team of astronomers using the Sloan Digital Sky Survey observed quasars behaving in a manner that completely upends conventional theory. Using images from the Pan-STARRS survey, the scientists identified 1,000 objects that appeared to vary in brightness over a period of just 10 years. Among these objects were a total of 5 galaxies that the team witnessed shape-shifting into quasars in a seemingly impossibly short period of time. The team also recorded a total of 12 quasars, quote, shutting down in a period of hundreds of days, rather than the hundreds of thousands of years required by standard theory. As reported by newscientist.com, astronomers expect quasars to use up their fuel and settle down into quiet galaxies, a process that should take hundreds of thousands of years. So last year, when 12 quasars were spotted shutting down in just hundreds of days, it was a shock. In subsequent decades, as demonstrated by the recent protests of Hawking and company, little has changed in the culture of science. Seemingly endless cosmic surprises have yet to force any real reassessment of the cherished 13.5 billion year, quote, history of the universe. Institutional science remains unready to confront the possibility that based on our current limited knowledge, we must accept a universe of unknown age and extent. So the surprises for cosmologists will only continue, since nature seems to have no regard for human beliefs. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
entered the theater of an alien sky. If the words and images seem strange to you, there's a reason for this. Our world was once a vastly different place. To experience this won't hurt you, and there is nothing to fear. In these discourses, we're following the origin and evolution of an ancient gathering of planets close to the Earth. The formation stretched across the ancient sky, but is no longer present. The planetary assembly was witnessed around the world, and amongst its evolutionary phases, we've listed a condition called the polar configuration. The defining feature of this phase was the alignment of the Earth's rotational axis to that of the gathered planets. Our review will require us to follow implications to their logical conclusions. We can call these the acid tests of the reconstruction, and these tests do not allow for contradictions at the foundational level. We've identified the gathered planets as the source of the mythic archetypes now documented within all of the well-developed early cultures. In their underlying integrity, these archetypes could not exist without the natural events that inspired them. The primary constituents of the polar configuration can be reliably named thanks to well-established astronomical traditions. The large sphere is the planet Saturn, the discharging star close to the center of Saturn as the planet Venus, and the smaller reddish sphere in front of Venus as the planet Mars. We've also briefly alluded to two subsequent phases. The phase of wandering, marked by instability, celestial conflict, and titanic wars of the gods. And then a further phase that we've titled the Ladder of Heaven, or alternately the backbone of the sky, which meant the ladder of heaven. It was the collapse of that final form that ended the myth-making epoch as the gods departed to become distant stars, more specifically, the respective planets as we observe them today. Based on research begun decades ago, we've also suggested that another planet not seen in our illustrated phase here was Jupiter, hidden behind Saturn and only revealed when instability set in, bringing the collapse of the polar configuration. In the course of these presentations, we've emphasized certain principles of reasoning that are essential when working with evidence drawn from a massive ancient record. The protocol requires us to work with a variety of mythic interpretations, tracing back to the same underlying forms. Concrete events in the sky, lacking any counterpart in the sky we observe today, provoked a variety of mythic interpretations. And that is why common explanations of the global patterns, the archetypes, never worked. The unified archetypal substructure of human memory does not allow for contrivances. In our most recent discourse, we noted the connection of the famous Medusa story to the archetype of the angry goddess, which means the terrible aspect of the planet Venus in world mythology, even if in many lands the planetary connection was lost in the chaos and reorganization of the solar system that followed. The global pattern, the archetype, was not lost. And that archetype can be reconstructed through systematic comparative analysis. Our analysis linked the story directly to the visual departure of Venus from its original position. With this displacement, the planet was no longer seen as the central eye or radiant heart and soul of the universal sovereign, meaning Saturn, but as an Earth-threatening chaos monster. In this chaotic condition, the former symmetrical star-like discharge streamers of Venus acquired a wildly disordered appearance, as the unstable motions of the planet appeared to threaten the entire celestial order, including our Earth itself. How did it happen that the body we now observe as a tranquil planet moving on a predictable path could have inspired memories of terror throughout the ancient world? That question invariably leads us to the ancient language of the planet Venus as a comet. Hence the truth of the matter. A vast library of evidence flatly precludes common assumptions about the history of the solar system. Neither historians nor theoretical scientists can afford to ignore the implications. This is why the rules of cross-cultural investigation are essential. Separate fragments of evidence are effectively useless when disconnected from larger patterns. And as the larger patterns are brought to light, it is also essential that they be followed back to their first occurrences, where the records themselves are closest to the original human experience. The comparative approach is not just an option, it is mandatory. Wherever diverse cultures use different words, different symbols, and different sacred practices to describe or reenact the same extraordinary events, that means a critical principle too long overlooked is awaiting discovery. I've made the point often, but it deserves repetition. Of the 5 visible planets, ancient cultures the world over identified only Venus as the mother goddess. Reason itself will not permit us to ignore that converging shout to us from the ancient cultures. With this universal identity in front of us, we can begin exploring more fully the ancient imagery of the mother goddess, including and reaching far beyond her explicit cometary attributes in a phase of cosmic instability. The best place to begin will be the sacred texts of ancient Egypt, which have preserved the story in the most vivid and original details, enabling us to see a global connection to the ground floor of human experience from which all of the archetypes, hundreds of them, anciently arose.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In a Space News episode earlier this year, we reported on the mysterious sounds associated with electromagnetic phenomena in Earth's atmosphere. In addition to centuries-old accounts of strange noises apparently connected to earthly auroras, we discussed the electrostatic noises reported by some witnesses of spectacular meteors. Today, a new scientific study published in the Geophysical Research Letters argues that the sounds associated with some meteor sightings are the products of electrical activity. As reported by Science magazine, as a meteor streaks through Earth's atmosphere, it ionizes the air around it, splitting it into heavy, positively charged ions and lighter, negatively charged electrons. The ions follow the meteor, whereas the electrons are deflected by Earth's magnetic field. The separation of positive and negative charges in the meteor's wake produces a large electric field that drives an electrical current. The authors state that the electric current launches radio waves, which are then conducted through nearby objects, producing audible sounds. This explanation brings mainstream scientists much closer to the electric universe interpretation. A key difference is that, according to electric universe proponents, any object that comes far from Earth will be differently charged and can discharge electrically when it enters the atmosphere. In the 2005 Thunderbolts Picture of the Day article, The Peekskill Meteor, authors Michael Armstrong and Jim Payette suggest that not only the electrophonic sounds of meteors, but also their bright glare, flare-ups, and disintegration involve electrical discharge activity. They state, one proposed explanation with which the electric universe would agree is that meteors and spacecraft trigger the formation of instabilities in plasma layers. The energy of the flickering and flaring, as well as of the low-frequency radiation, comes more from the ionospheric plasma than from the meteoroid. The meteors that we've come to think of as, quote, burning up in the atmosphere may instead be the targets of mini thunderbolts from the ionosphere. For many decades, institutional science has imagined that spectacular meteor explosions occur when fast-moving bolides encounter extreme pressure, heat, and chemical reactions when passing through Earth's upper atmosphere. But this interpretation has left many unresolved mysteries. In fact, the most renowned meteor explosion in modern times leaves many facts that beg for a new interpretation. In 1908, in a remote region of central Siberia, a blue-white fireball, which some described as brighter than the sun, exploded with the force of a 10 to 15 megaton hydrogen bomb. The explosion felled some 60 million trees across an area of 2,000 square kilometers. Yet some trees near the blast center were not burnt, and a ring of burnt trees circling the epicenter was left standing. The thunderous clouds were accompanied by a shock wave that knocked people off their feet and broke windows hundreds of kilometers away. The explosion registered on seismic stations across Europe and Asia, and as far away as Britain, meteorologists registered fluctuations in atmospheric pressure. The resulting pulse of air pressure circled the Earth twice, and astronomers observed for several nights afterwards a glowing red haze in the upper atmosphere, though they were not aware of the cause at the time. Curiously, as noted in the Australian Journal of Astronomy in 1993, the Sir Douglas Mawson expedition in Antarctica reported an extensive auroral display a few hours before the Tunguska event. Many historical accounts also exist of strange weather, including lightning and thunder, and even seismic activity well before the devastating explosion. Despite occasional claims to the contrary, no impact crater for the intruding body has ever been found, nor the remains of an impactor. Though some have occasionally claimed to have discovered Tunguska meteorite fragments. Nevertheless, Tunguska remains officially classified as the largest impact event ever recorded on Earth. In the electric universe theory, the energy released from an intruding comet, asteroid, or meteor is not limited by its mass and kinetic energy, but also the electrical energy due to its charge differential with Earth. This stored electrical energy also explains the astonishing effects of the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9's explosion as it approached Jupiter, including the completely unexpected, dramatic brightening of the gas giant's radiation belts. Similar effects were seen on Mars when the close passage of the comet Sightings spring, quote, blew away part of Mars's upper atmosphere. Calculations of the mass and size of the Tunguska bolide, based solely on mechanical considerations, cannot be accurate. These principles were more recently demonstrated in 2013, when a meteor exploded in the sky over the Urals region in Russia. Thousands of homes and buildings were damaged, and more than 1,400 were injured by an explosion that produced as much energy as 24 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. The object is said to be the largest to have, quote, struck the Earth since Tunguska. It's important to note that based on infrasound data from around the world, NASA scientists stated that the meteorite had to be about 1,000 times larger than they originally thought based on the object's visual trail. As Wal Thornhill explains in a 2003 article, in the study of meteors, a key element that institutional science has long overlooked is, quote, the connection between ionized meteor trails and electrical discharge activity in the ionosphere. The meteor trail acts as a giant lightning rod that connects the conducting ionosphere to the upper atmosphere. If the Earth is an electrical body in an electrical solar system, it is the equivalent of a temporary short circuit of a giant capacitor. The current flowing along the meteor trail gives rise to the unexplained brilliance and long-lasting glows of some meteors. It causes them to disintegrate like an exploding capacitor, high in the atmosphere. The Tunguska explosion was probably the most noteworthy example of the effect. Increasingly today, scientists are proposing electrical processes as the answers to long-standing mysteries on comets, asteroids, and meteors, revealing a slow yet inevitable recognition of our electric universe. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to Thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In 2014, astronomers puzzled over the unprecedented discovery of an asteroid with its own ring system. The asteroid Chariklo, which is 250 kilometers in diameter and orbits between Saturn and Uranus, displays two rings that are said to be similar in nature to those of Saturn. The leader of a 2014 study said of the discovery, "We weren't looking for a ring and didn't think small bodies like Chariklo had them at all. So the discovery and the amazing amount of detail we saw in the system came as a complete surprise." Today, scientists performing computer simulations are suggesting that only two possibilities can account for the continued existence of Chariklo's perplexing rings. They say that either the particles composing the rings are much smaller than models have predicted, or that a hypothetical shepherd satellite around the asteroid must be gravitationally stabilizing the rings. In fact, the scientists are surprised that the rings haven't already disintegrated, since their simulations suggest a much shorter life. A Phys.org report on the team's research states, "The density of the ring particles must be less than half the density of Chariklo itself." Their results also showed that a striped pattern, known as, quote, self-gravity wakes, forms in the inner ring due to interactions between the particles. These self-gravity wakes accelerate the breakup of the ring. The team recalculated the expected lifetime of Chariklo's rings based on their results and found it to be only 1 to 100 years, much shorter than previous estimates. This is so short that it's surprising the ring is still there. Chariklo is a member of a family of asteroids between the orbits of Saturn and Uranus, called the Centaurs. In the past, the Centaurs have occasionally surprised scientists with their comet-like behaviors and created some confusion as to their classification as either asteroids or comets. The electric universe theory has always stated that the only real difference between comets and asteroids are their respective orbits, and both can discharge electrically when moving through regions of changing electric potential. This theory, as proposed by the chief principals of the Thunderbolts Project, also states that comets, asteroids, and meteoroids were recently electrically torn from planetary surfaces. The late astronomer Tom Van Flandern proposed his own theory of the birth of comets and asteroids, suggesting they are the remains of an exploded planet. Van Flandern argued that the characteristics of the orbits of asteroids, particularly those between Mars and Jupiter in the asteroid belt, show all of the features of material having been recently ejected into space. Van Flandern made the seemingly outrageous prediction that asteroids would tend to have natural satellites, which was almost universally dismissed by astronomers. However, in more recent years, many asteroids have been found to have their own moons. In the case of Chariklo, physicist Wal Thornhill has agreed with the notion that the asteroid likely has shepherd satellites maintaining the rings. Astronomers have assumed that the material composing the rings was removed from the asteroid by a violent collision. But the kind of fine dust in the rings is not what one would expect from a mechanical collision. Indeed, as reported on this series, in more recent years, scientists have increasingly acknowledged electrostatic dust-raising events on both comets and asteroids. Nevertheless, the cometary behavior of some asteroids continues to pose a great mystery for astronomers. In 2013, the asteroid P2013 P5 astonished investigators when it suddenly sprouted 6 comet-like tails, forcing scientists to eventually reclassify the asteroid as a main belt comet. Researchers suggested that the force of sunlight hitting the asteroid may have caused a mysterious and sudden increase in its spin rate, causing dust material to fly off into space. It was then suggested that radiation was able to, quote, stretch and confine the removed material into tail-like forms. However, both the machining of the dust from the asteroid and its confinement into comet tails could more easily be explained as electrical discharge phenomena. Cheriklov's ring system has led to the reinforcement of the idea that the dust material in the rings might eventually coalesce into a small moon. But the notion of colliding particles accreting into planetary-sized bodies has never been shown to work. In fact, experiments on Earth suggest that collisions will tend to disintegrate material exceeding mere centimeters. Indeed, among the many problems with the collisional theory of the formation of moons, if the satellites in our solar system were formed by collisions, one would expect to find a neat gradation of their properties. However, the respective satellites of the gas giants Saturn and Jupiter are so different that it seems doubtful they were formed in the same way and by the same body. It is surely telling that the consensus story of the origins and behaviors of asteroids and comets continues to be challenged by science discovery. The evidence simply does not support the notion that these bodies are billions of years old, tracing back to the solar system's infancy. But how many asteroid and comet mysteries will be resolved if scientists will finally entertain a recent, catastrophic history of our solar system? For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to Thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. On planet Earth, the most obvious and dramatic display of electricity in nature is lightning. But what causes lightning? Although there currently is a consensus opinion about the processes that produce lightning and clouds on Earth, most scientists freely admit that many mysteries remain. On this series, we have discussed several discoveries that add to the mysteries, including the finding that solar storms cause increased lightning on Earth, and the ongoing puzzle of lightning that occurs above thunderclouds, reaching towards space. In this episode, Thunderbolt's colleague Andrew Hall explores the evidence that lightning is a product of the electromagnetic circuitry connecting the Earth and the Sun.
The following image is from NOAA and illustrates the consensus theory of lightning genesis. As you can see, it shows electrons collecting like marbles in a sink, accelerating down a slippery slope into what looks like a drain. A typical cloud-to-ground lightning needs 1 billion trillion electrons. Are electrons just randomly floating in the clouds when suddenly 1 billion trillion of them jump into an imaginary drain pipe like this image portrays? The consensus notion is that charge builds in thunderstorms because of static electricity. The friction of hailstones and rain colliding in the storm generates static charge, like rubbing a balloon against hair or shuffling feet on carpet. Positive and negative charged particles from this friction separate into layers according to the consensus notion. The layers where they are found pooling are at distinct thermal boundaries. So it's thought these thermal boundary layers keep the pools of charge apart, except when they arc. The situation is depicted in this NOAA image of a supercell, where layers of charge are shown stratified inside the cloud. To become coherent, stratified, and able to build enough charge for a 5-mile-long lightning bolt, 1 billion trillion electrons worth. The charge density required implies a plasma is involved. In fact, it's more than an implication. How else could so much charge collect to create such arcs? There's no wire in the sky, no battery terminal or electrode to generate an arc. These pools of charge must be plasmas. It only takes 1% of neutral air to be ionized for it to behave as a plasma. Lightning genesis requires a plasma because that is what forms the electrode in the sky. Let's consider lightning and how, why, and where plasma forms to play a role in making it. We know Earth's atmosphere is an electric circuit. It carries charge, current, and voltage. The air is a weak conductor with a variable vertical current between the ground and ionosphere of 1 to 3 picoamps per square meter. The resistance of the atmosphere is 200 ohms. The clear sky voltage potential averages 200 to 400,000 volts between Earth and the upper atmosphere. At any given moment, there are about 2,000 lightning storms occurring worldwide. To create lightning, the electric field potential must overcome the dielectric breakdown of air at 3 million volts per meter. It does so because the electric field in a thunderstorm jumps to over 300 million volts. A typical lightning bolt is 3 to 5 miles long and momentarily delivers about 30,000 amps to ground. The collective current from a typical storm delivers from 1/2 to 1 amp. The circuit is completed, a worldwide current from Earth to sky, and storms that return it from sky to ground. The 2,000 concurrent lightning storms, each about 1.5 amps, means this worldwide current is about 3,000 amps. Only that isn't the whole story, because there is much more science doesn't know about Earth's circuitry. There is also an exchange from atmosphere to space and space to atmosphere. This is yet to be accurately measured or understood. The existence of plasma discharges from thunderstorms to space, called sprites, nones, and elves for their brief and ethereal appearance, is a relatively recent scientific discovery. Their genesis, power, and frequency is far from understood. While Thornhill discusses these phenomena in much more detail in his article, The Balloon Goes Up Over Lightning, which is on his Holoscience website. Cosmic rays enter the atmosphere, adding charge continuously. The way Earth is exposed to solar wind fluctuates widely, both because the solar current fluctuates and so does the strength of the Earth's magnetic field. Sometimes the shield it provides moves around, letting more cosmic rays enter through holes. Electricity flows around Earth in Birkeland currents molded by the geomagnetic field. How these currents fluctuate in density and the resulting induced currents in the atmosphere and ground is another area of scientific uncertainty. Because of the variability, variety, and the fact they haven't noticed until recently, consensus science can't yet understand how much current is entering or leaving Earth's atmospheric system from space. The ground also carries potential that varies. Except for the monochrome view of seismic returns, we can't even see what is below the Earth's crust to comprehend the flow of the current there, nor whether, how, or where Earth's current might enter the atmosphere. For electricity, boundary layers like the Earth's crust isn't an impermeable barrier. It's an electrode. There's a cavity defined by the surface of the Earth and the inner edge of the ionosphere. It's been calculated that at any moment, the total charge residing in this cavity is 500,000 coulombs. Electromagnetic waves reflect from the boundary of the cavity, the ground, and the ionosphere, and establish quasi-standing electromagnetic waves at resonant frequencies. W.O. Schumann predicted the resonant properties of the cavity in 1952, and they were first detected in 1954. They are called Schumann's resonances and are measured as broadband electromagnetic impulses at frequencies in the range of 5 to 50 hertz. The atmosphere is undeniably electric. It's not a few ions benignly floating around in the air, occasionally forming into pools of charge, but a globally active and coherent circuit. What should that tell us about lightning? Mustn't it also be part of this coherent resonant system? Doesn't it beg for a better model than marbles in a drain pipe? Fortunately, there is a model to look at. It's called electronics. Atmospheric arcs created in a circuit are generally recognized to occur by thermionic emission. Everyone has seen a hot cathode arcing, like in a welding arc, where electrons are freed from the metal surface of the electrode by heat. The metal is heated by its own resistance to current and begins emitting electrons above a certain temperature threshold specific to the electrode material. The temperature for many materials is thousands of degrees. Another form of discharge, less well recognized, is field emission or cold cathode emissions. They do not generate electrons by thermionic emission. The electrode warms, but not appreciably because heat is not what frees the electrons. It's the electric field strength, a high voltage potential that strips electrons from whatever material is present, including the air itself. When this happens, the field forms ionic matter into a plasma structure called a corona. Corona is the electron in the sky that discharges lightning. Coronal discharge is used in a variety of ways in modern technology. It requires a high voltage, which is precisely what is present in a thunderstorm, 300 million volts, 1,000 times stronger than in clear weather. Corona is the only electrical phenomenon that can result in a non-thermionic discharge under atmospheric conditions. It's the driving force of the storm and the generator of lightning. Corona occurs in a layer perpendicular to the electric field where the field strips electrons from atoms, sending them downward at near the speed of light along the field gradient to collide inevitably with another atom. The collision strips more electrons free to follow the electric field, leaving ions behind. The region where electrons are stripped is a cold partial plasma. Increasing charge density by stripping and collision amplifies and shapes the electric field, which self-organizes into a corona. The pools of charge layered in the atmosphere are not pools of positive and negative charges depicted, but coronas that exhibit positive or negative polarity, composed of some mixture of ions and neutral species electrically interacting. Free electrons continue the process of collision in what's called an avalanche. Avalanche is portrayed in the step leader process depicted in the image and is a witness precursor to a lightning bolt. The avalanche is one half of the picture, however. Lightning comes from below as much as from above. The electric field also pools positive ions on the ground below the storm. Ionic streamers, filaments of positively charged air, stretch up the electric field toward the clouds. A lightning bolt occurs when the cascading step leader and streamer meet, completing a plasma channel. None of this is seen with the naked eye. It's all dark current up to this point. The lightning channel is complete when it connects to a ground streamer. The connection allows a dump of electrons from the corona to ground. Then heavier and significantly slower ions carry up the channel in a return stroke. Return stroke can be seen in the image as the bright flash that occurs the moment the first tendril of the avalanche current strikes Earth, leaving only one path glowing after the flash. Corona provides the reservoir of charge and the dark current mechanism for avalanche required to make an arc. This is what is missing in the consensus notions. The other consensus notion that static charge builds from hailstone collisions is also inadequate. A study using interferometer and Doppler radar to correlate lightning with updraft and downdraft winds showed that lightning forms in low-pressure winds around the storm cell updraft of warm, moist air. As a storm organizes and the updraft speeds up, lightning frequency dramatically intensifies. Updraft winds don't produce much lightning until they reach 10 to 20 miles an hour, the study found. Then strike frequency escalates with updraft speed. From 20 to 50 miles per hour wind speeds, lightning frequency might be 5 to 20 strikes per minute, whereas above 90 miles per hour, the flash rate can exceed 1 strike per second. It's like a motor running, and the central updraft is the primary mover. Water in a thunderstorm updraft goes through all of its phases, from water vapor to cloud condensate to rain droplet to ice. The structure of a thunderstorm is oriented vertically around a central updraft. The phase changes stratify charge at temperatures where the transitions create ionization events. Water is self-ionizing. Water in its liquid state undergoes autoionization when two water molecules form one hydroxide anion and one hydronium cation. Water can further be ionized by impurities such as carbon dioxide to form carbonic acid. Water condensing into clouds and droplets within a strong electric field provides an ionization event. Water can become supersaturated, rising above 100% relative humidity if air is rapidly cooled. For example, by rising suddenly in an updraft. A supersaturation instability provides another opportunity for ionization. Ice is typically a positive charge carrier, meaning that current flows over its surface in streams of positive ions. Flash freezing water onto ice as hailstones grow provides another opportunity for ionization. Each layer of air in a storm has different temperature, humidity, pressure, and velocity, transporting different phases of water at different partial pressures, which means the conductivity of the air is changing too. This last item is important to remember. More about how this creates coronas requires a broader look at the circuitry of a supercell thunderstorm, which you will find interesting because it will show how coronas produce other effects. Perhaps it even explains all the effects of a thunderstorm. The electrical circuitry of a supercell will be continued in the next companion article on Earth's electrical weather. Over the series of articles we'll present, corona and its role in our weather will lead back to geology and previously presented discussions of arc blast and how mountains are built. Like all things electric, fractal forms repeat, such that a coherent picture emerges. And boy, have we got a picture for you. Thank you.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. The following presentation is an adaptation of the Stephen Smith Picture of the Day article, Straighten Up. The link to the article may be found in the description box of this video. Conventional cosmological theories state that a black hole forms when a star with a mass about 5 times that of the Sun reaches the stage in its evolution where its thermonuclear fuel is used up. Since stars are thought to be internally powered fusion reactors, it is the outward push of radiation from inside a star that prevents its collapse under the force of its own gravity. As the standard model of stellar evolution speculates, a star accumulates heavier atomic nuclei in its core, making it impossible to keep its outer surface away with radiative pressure. Gravity overcomes fusion, so the star's gaseous envelope suddenly collapses, rebounding off the core in what astronomers call a, quote, supernova explosion. Since its gravity is no longer hindered by the radiating core, the star is said to shrink under that force, disappearing from normal space, compressing into a mass with no geometry. A ghost of the star's presence remains as an irresistible gravitational source. That concept drives all ideas about galactic scale behavior, since it is assumed that 98% of all galaxies are inhabited by so-called supermassive black holes. Among electric universe advocates, black holes are a questionable quantity, despite claims to the contrary. No black hole has ever been observed. What is observed are effects that can be attributed to something other than ultra-dense matter, and that is electricity. According to a recent press release, quote, supermassive black holes in a region of the distant universe are all spinning out radio jets in the same direction. As Professor Ramil Dave from the University of the Western Cape wrote, this is not obviously expected based on our current understanding of cosmology. It's a bizarre finding. Most astrophysicists try to explain narrowly confined jets by invoking words like nozzle or high pressure, contrary to the behavior of gases in a vacuum. Some acknowledge that magnetic fields might focus gases into narrow beams, although there is a commonly held opinion that magnetic fields are not important. However, magnetic fields are only one part of the story. Failing to realize that electric currents create electromagnetic fields has led many physicists to model plasma in space without considering electricity. In an electric universe, gravity gives way to the effects of plasma. The stars are not hot, dense balls of hydrogen. Rather, they are plasma, with fusion taking place on their surfaces and not in their cores. The electric universe definition of plasma is not the conventional one of, quote, ionized gas. Plasma is a state of matter. Properties such as filamentation, long-range attraction, and short-range repulsion. Braiding, formation and decay of plasmoids and other phenomena contribute to the plasma condition. Everything in the universe is ionized to some degree. Therefore, it is plasma. Positive ions and negative electrons move through plasma in ways not governed by gravity. Although gravity might cause some heavy positive ions to create a charge surplus in one volume of space over another. When that happens, a weak electric field develops. An electric field initiates electric currents that generate electromagnetic fields. Those fields interact with other fields generated by other currents. In images from space, as well as in high-speed photographs of plasma activity in the laboratory, those currents form twisted pairs of filaments called Birkeland currents. Birkeland currents follow magnetic fields and draw charged material from their surroundings. Electromagnetism, quote, pinches the dust and plasma into heated blobs of matter called plasmoids. As the electric field intensifies, it increases the pinch effect, forming spinning electrical discharges. At first, they glow dimly red, then blaze yellow, and finally, they might become brilliant ultraviolet arcs, called stars, driven by the electric currents that created them. Cosmic filaments have structure. Each is composed of smaller filaments that scale to an unknown extent. It has been demonstrated that plasma phenomena can scale to 14 orders of magnitude. Nobel laureate Hannes Alfvén hypothesized that the scale can go to 28 orders of magnitude or more. Stars are nodes in electric circuits. Electromagnetic energy could be stored in the equatorial current sheets surrounding them until some trigger event causes them to switch into a polar discharge. The electric jet could receive its energy from a natural particle accelerator, a, quote, plasma double layer with a strong electric field. Toroidal magnetic fields form because of the polar plasma discharge, confining it into a narrow channel. Only electric fields can accelerate charged particles across interstellar space. Since Birkeland currents are filamentary, and since stars and galaxies occur in strings, the alignment of galactic jets observed by radio astronomers is not due to a, quote, coherent spin in the structure of this volume of space. It is due to the collimated nature of those electric currents. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. New scientific reports suggest that ancient stone carvings confirm that a great comet struck the Earth over 10,000 years ago. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland have studied the perplexing symbols carved on stone pillars at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. They have concluded that the markings in effect document a bombardment of comet fragments that hit Earth around 11,000 BC. Lead investigator Dr. Martin Sweatman says of the research, "It appears Göbekli Tepe was, among other things, an observatory for monitoring the night sky. One of its pillars seems to have served as a memorial to this devastating event, probably the worst day in history since the end of the Ice Age." He continues, "I think this research, along with the recent finding of a widespread platinum anomaly across the North American continent, virtually seals the case in favor of a comet impact. Our work serves to reinforce that physical evidence. What is happening here is the process of paradigm change. But if ancient stone carvings count as evidence of actual events, a far more sweeping paradigm change may be necessary. For nearly half a century, the founder of the Thunderbolts Project, David Talbot, has identified countless global patterns in ancient myth, symbols, and storytelling, which, under strict forensic guidelines, allow a reconstruction of extraordinary events. Talbot offered an introduction to his work in the feature-length documentary film, Symbols of an Alien Sky. In his ongoing video series, Discourses on an Alien Sky, he offers more detailed analysis of specific mythical themes, none of which can be understood in terms of anything observed in the sky today. We asked David Talbot for his summary of this latest claim of an ancient comet impact.
One thing's pretty clear. The global headlines were calculated to draw attention. From the British publication New Scientist, we read, "Ancient carvings show comet hit Earth and triggered mini ice age." Or another popular media headline, "End of the world, ancient Göbekli Tepe vulture stone." And also this, "Ancient observatory may hold secret to comet collision and sudden climate change." Climate change even, with possible shifts in Earth's rotational axis. But no such thing is actually documented in any version of the story. The explosion of headlines around the world was ignited by a random speculation in reference to archaeological findings in Turkey going back to the 1960s. One headline after another looking for a story. And yet there is a story reaching far beyond this meager report. The real story has occurred across decades as scholars have begun to notice carvings on stone, raising the possibility that certain common themes might have been provoked by unusual celestial events. The original work of plasma scientist Tony Peratt, showing profound similarities between rock art carvings of the so-called stick man and also the ladder of heaven, concretely identifiable as electric discharge configurations in the laboratory. That was real science, and it helped to animate the electric universe community more than 15 years ago. From the recent headline-grabbing announcement, you would not even know that there are recurrent themes in rock art, or that these themes find counterparts in early human storytelling and in sacred practices the world over. This cross-cultural accord requires systematic investigation, and without that, you're left with nothing but a wild guess. Why should anyone believe that the obscure picture shown here depicts either a comet or a swarm of comets? The carving itself gives no reason to believe such a thing. And yet it is significant that today's scholars appear increasingly willing to consider a celestial referent. What they need to consider is the vast field of evidence and a vantage point that works, and provably works. My own conclusion from years of research touching directly on this field is uncompromising. Isolated artwork and storytelling never provide sufficient content for a reliable reconstruction. Reliable conclusions are possible only when one takes into account the worldwide patterns, and that requires systematic attention to a broad field of evidence. The patterns to be explored include storytelling, artistic representations, and ancient reenactments of Earth-altering events. Nothing less than a global, cross-cultural investigation would lead to any reliable conclusions. The greatest surprise for me was that there are far more global patterns than I'd even imagined possible. Hundreds of archetypes, all vitally connected to each other, and you won't find anything more compelling than that provable fact. Without a referent at the fundamental level of cross-cultural archetypes, no explanation could advance beyond a mere conjecture. Nevertheless, it is encouraging to see a general interest in unusual possibilities, something potentially profound in the ancient sky, something not occurring today. That does make good sense, and could be the beginning of real advances in the study of the ancient cultures and of planetary history as well.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
Just entered the theater of an alien sky. If the words and images seem strange to you, there's a reason for this. Our world was once a vastly different place. To experience this won't hurt you, and there is nothing to fear. Amongst the most terrifying figures of Greek mythology were the monstrous Gorgons. The Gorgon idea emerged as an overarching symbol of terror wherever its influence reached. Most modern treatments of the subject imply that there were 3 Gorgons, but the historical evidence makes clear that only one was known more anciently, the Gorgo, one goddess with a threefold aspect. Today, it's commonly recognized that the Gorgon triad was originally indistinguishable from another well-known triad called the Grey, described as 3 goddesses sharing a single eye. That's a clue and surely no coincidence. In the popular telling of the Gorgon story, only one figure stands out, and that is the terrifying Medusa. Artists and poets depicted Medusa's disordered hair as a tangle of snakes. Well, that's a clue too, because the image of snaky locks is just too close to the wildly disheveled hair of the archetypal angry goddess. But what was meant by the goddess's threefold aspect? That root form is no accident either, no random turn in the evolution of mythic symbolism. It points directly back to the archetypal triangular form of the so-called triple goddess discussed in previous discourses. Seen in its historical context, the image takes us back to the visual appearance of the planet Venus in the polar configuration. More specifically, the emergence of the archaic goddess from the triangular seed of creation itself. To understand the theme, we need only envision Venus and its concrete, central relationship to the massive sphere of the primeval sun, meaning in the early astronomical traditions, the planet Saturn. In following the evolution of the goddess image over time, we find that lovely and terrible aspects of one mythic archetype were progressively transformed into two separately named personalities. By this evolutionary process occurring across many centuries, the triple goddess and her terrible aspect emerged as a quasi-independent symbol of fear and destruction. But when we trace the theme back to its origins, we meet Medusa's archaic connection to a far-famed personality, Athena, a connection now widely acknowledged in comparative studies. There is good reason why we see the head of Medusa in the center of the very aegis or shield with which Athena herself was so closely identified. Then suddenly Athena's critical role in the story makes perfect sense. When the poets declared that it was Athena who placed the Medusa head in the center of her own aegis, that helped to maintain a distinction of the goddess from her own terrible aspect. Let the friendly and unfriendly faces of the goddess stand in opposition to each other, as if they signified independent forces. Not surprisingly, we see the same Gorgon head in the center of the shield of Heracles, and in shield symbolism more generally. That is how the terrible goddess came to stand as the great protectress, placed in the service of the archetypal warrior hero. The same idea stands out in the placement of the Medusa head over the entrances to temples, underscoring the angry goddess's original function as protectress. As we've seen in earlier discourses, this was nothing else than the terrifying glory, or face of glory, celebrated as the great protectress amongst neighboring cultures, with precisely the same protective function. As should be expected, the tangled hair easily merged with other symbols of the planet Venus's cometary aspect. For instance, the improbably bearded form of the gray, of which Medusa was a mere variant. The incongruous beard was an explicit ancient symbol for the comet. Most obvious parallels were the bearded Greek goddess Aphrodite and her counterpart, the bearded Latin Venus, Venus barbata, conveying precisely the same meaning. Such images were part of the progressive separation of the goddess's ugly or terrifying aspect from her lovely aspect. As in all cases that we've previously explored, the explanation lies in the underlying identity of the mother goddess, tracing to a time before the personality split, as we've seen in all of the goddess's more archaic forms. One archetypal goddess, simultaneously displaying both the lovely and the terrible aspects in one story. And so the question, how significant is it that not a single word from specialists have ever been offered as a plausible explanation for the dilemma, either for the personality split in general or for the Medusa theme in particular? Not surprisingly, the legends declared that Medusa was originally a beautiful maiden, but Athena changed the Gorgo's lovely hair to frightful snakes. In words attributed to the warrior Perseus, the poet Ovid states, "Her beauty was far famed, and of all her charms, her hair was loveliest." Of course, that's the distinguishing attribute of the mother goddess herself. In fact, the separate fragments confirm everything we would expect to find. It was said that the Gorgon was beheaded because she had been willing, quote, to be compared with Athena in beauty. Athena, slighted by her own alter ego, one might say. And so the text reads, Athena, for fitting punishment, transformed the Gorgo's lovely hair to loathsome snakes. And now the goddess, to strike her foes with dread, upon her breastplate wears the snakes she made. Well, that's quite a giveaway of the original story. To preserve the more noble and revered aspects of Athena, the chronicler set the goddess in opposition to her own terrible aspect. As we shall see in the discourses to follow, this was a pervasive strategy in ancient storytelling, aimed at preserving the integrity of one's own culture while linking the darker side of celebrated mythic personalities to their enemies, often their own cultural neighbors. From this habit, we can learn a lot about both the celestial events and the psychologies at work within the early cultures. The lovely and terrible goddess impacted human history up to a remarkable scale.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. New scientific reports may provide insights into catastrophic events that once occurred on the planet Mars. Scientists at an observatory in Northern Ireland have conducted analysis of 9 asteroids that orbit Mars, called Trojans, and they've come to the conclusion that the asteroids are the remains of a former planet. The team discovered that the so-called Trojans appear to be composed of the same material, including the mineral olivine, which only forms at extremely high temperatures and is thought to be associated with planetary collisions. The team has concluded that the asteroids orbiting Mars are pieces of a former mini-planet, or planetesimal, which was destroyed eons ago by collisions. Those who have followed the Thunderbolts Project may understand why neither mechanical collisions nor a hypothetical former planet are necessary to explain the asteroid's formation. For decades, the chief principals of the Thunderbolts Project, Dave Talbot and Wal Thornhill, have proposed a very different history for Mars and all of the planets in the inner solar system. In ancient myth, Mars was identified as both the warrior hero and as his own weapon, the cosmic thunderbolt. Thornhill and Talbot state that Mars was devastated by electrical discharges in an epoch of planetary instability in the relatively recent past, perhaps several thousand years ago in prehistory. As, quote, radical as the theory may seem, it explains and in fact continues to successfully predict countless discoveries that only prove puzzling to planetary scientists. More than 6 miles of crustal depth was mysteriously removed from the Martian northern hemisphere. Consider also the many millions of cubic kilometers excavated from Mars in the formation of the stupendous feature known as Valles Marineris. Material from Mars still occasionally strikes the Earth in the form of mysterious meteorites. Indeed, the discovery of Martian meteorites was treated with great initial skepticism, since astronomers could not envision the escaped material reaching the necessary velocities to bring the material to Earth. If electrical discharges did in fact devastate the red planet from pole to pole, both the so-called Trojan asteroids and the presence of the mineral olivine are to be expected. No collisions with former planets are necessary. The mineral olivine presented a puzzle when it was discovered completely unexpectedly on a comet. Such was the case with the Stardust Next mission to the comet Wild 2 in 2004. NASA investigators were amazed to discover olivine and other minerals that only form at superhot temperatures in dust samples from a so-called dirty snowball. As NASA curator Michael Zelensky said at the time, "That's a big surprise. People thought comets would just be cold stuff that formed out where things are very cold. It was kind of a shock to not just find one, but several of these, which implies they are pretty common in the comet." In fact, in the electric universe hypothesis, comets, asteroids, and meteoroids did not accrete billions of years ago in the solar system's infancy. but they were in fact torn from planetary surfaces by electrical discharges. NASA scientists were also amazed to discover the mineral tridymite on Mars, which only forms at extremely high temperatures and is thought to result from a kind of volcanism never suspected on Mars. As NASA geochemist Richard Morris said of the discovery, "It's really nifty, but we were shocked. There's no evidence for plate tectonics on Mars. That's why it's such a surprise to find this tridymite." However, as noted in a recent Space News report, tridymite has been reported to form as a product of lightning in a roofing slate, as documented in the book The Data of Geochemistry. In the feature-length documentary film, The Lightning-Scarred Planet Mars, detailed analysis is given of countless geological features on Mars that find ideal analogs in laboratory experiments with electrical discharges. One such example is the towering Olympus Mons, a nearly 22-kilometer high so-called shield volcano, and the tallest mountain of any planet in the solar system. As noted in the film, this shield volcano interpretation of Olympus Mons presents far more enigmas than answers. The defining feature of a shield volcano is a gentle extrusion of fluid or low-viscosity lava. Shield volcanoes on Earth do not present a scarp, whereas the scarp of Olympus Mons towers at nearly 4 miles high. A NASA report freely acknowledges the scarp is of unknown origin. The steep cliff around Olympus Mons is peculiar and not characteristic of terrestrial shield volcanoes. But perhaps most striking of all may be the blanket of incredibly fine, filamentary ridges and ravines within the terrain of Olympus Mons. In fact, the continuing discovery of perplexing dendritic patterns on Mars is a key prediction of the electrical scarring hypothesis. New images taken by NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter reveal precisely the kinds of features expected from electrical discharges. Consider this recently released image of the terrain within the 10-kilometer Zunil crater on Mars. Scientists insist that the crater was produced by an impact, but they have no real explanation for the raised dendritic features associated with secondary craters within the crater. NASA's description of the image reads as follows. Secondary craters form from rocks ejected at high speed from the primary crater, which then impact the ground at sufficiently high speed to make up huge numbers of much smaller craters over a large region. In this scene, however, the secondary crater ejecta has an unusual raised relief appearance, like bas-relief sculpture. The best guess that NASA can offer is that the so-called impact crater has been mysteriously weathered over eons of time. The agency states, "One idea is that the region was covered with a layer of fine-grained materials like dust or pyroclastics about 1 to 2 meters thick when the Zunil impact occurred about 1 million years ago. And the ejecta served to harden or otherwise protect the fine-grained layer from later erosion by the wind." But experimental research within the electric universe community provides far more promising possibilities. One such experiment, conducted by Billy Elverton, produced raised dendritic ridges simply by applying intense vibrations to soil. Consider also this experiment performed by YouTube user DiveFlyFish, subjecting aluminum foil to electrical discharge. Indeed, we have called the Martian environment a, quote, laboratory in space, ideal for testing the concepts of electric universe geology. It was well over a decade ago that physicist Dr. C.J. Ransom of VimaSat Laboratories was able to reproduce the mysterious so-called Martian blueberries by blasting quantities of hematite with an electric arc. Only one of many such pathways of investigation, as repeatedly outlined on this series, as well as many dozens of picture-of-the-day articles on Thunderbolts.info. Electrical discharges produce effects that could account for much of the consistently bizarre Martian geology. Space discovery today routinely provides surprising discoveries about the Martian environment. As human exploration brings Mars into ever finer focus, we confidently predict that the evidence will continue to mount for catastrophic events that left their indelible imprint on the red planet. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to Thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Comet science may stand at the precipice of revolutionary change. For well over half a century, consensus scientific theory has proposed that comets are icy bodies that formed billions of years ago in the solar system's infancy. Comet activity, including the production of filamentary jets and a cometary coma, is said to result from the sublimation of ices as a comet's orbit brings it closer to the sun. However, for many years, scientific discovery has done nothing to increase confidence in standard comet theory. Close-up images of comet nuclei have revealed desiccated terrains, with nothing like the expected abundance of surface ice, and the hypothesized subsurface comet ice remains conjecture. Scientists have never found the theoretical vents or nozzles from which comet jets are thought to emanate, just one of many puzzles that demand new pathways of investigation. Electrical theories of comets may provide such pathways. Many of the most surprising comet discoveries were either predicted or become explicable by electrical interpretations, including the discovery of fast-moving electrons and electric fields close to the nucleus of Comet 67P. The detection of the signature of water molecules in cometary comas has long been thought to confirm the existence of abundant subsurface comet ice. But is there a better explanation? For several years, Thunderbolt's colleague Dr. Franklin Andariba has developed concepts of electrochemical reactions on comets, which may be the cause of much comet activity, including the production of the detected comet water. Recently, scientists studying data on the Lovejoy comet C2014 Q2 have reported findings that may affirm many of the principles Dr. Andariba has proposed. Today, Dr. Andariba offers a detailed analysis of these findings and explains the electrochemical processes that may happen on comets.
Let us put things in perspective. After the completion of the Rosetta probe journey around the comet 67P, the origin of water observed in the coma is not clear, especially since the surface of the comet has been determined to be dark and dry. However, there are other possibilities for the origin of such water. Let us discuss one possibility. In a recent paper by Pagini et al., titled Ground-Based Detection of Deuterated Water in Comet C/2014 Q2, also known as Lovejoy, at infrared wavelengths, published in the Astrophysical Journal Letters, Comet Lovejoy is studied via infrared spectroscopy at an Earth-based observatory using infrared emission lines for water, H2O, and heavy water, HDO, where D refers to deuterium, which contains 1 proton, 2 neutrons, 1 electron, unlike hydrogen, which contains 1 of each. The study used a near-infrared spectrometer located at the Keck Observatory during post-perihelion. The results suggest a water production rate of 5.9 times 10 to the 29 molecules per second, or about 17,641,196 liters per second, and a heavy water production rate of 3.6 times 10 to the 26 molecules per second, or about 11,355 liters per second. From these production rates, the DH ratio in Comet Lovejoy's water is extracted to be 3.02 times 10 to the minus 4, or more meaningfully, about 1.94 versus the DNS standard mean-ocean DH ratio, which is taken as the benchmark and refers to the DH ratio in the ocean on Earth. It is important to highlight in this report that this DH ratio was methodically obtained by avoiding unnecessary systematic variables such as measurements of different days, different telescopes, as well as observations of water and heavy water separately. Subsequently, this DH ratio is compared against measurements carried out pre-perihelion via radio wave means, which display a ratio of only 0.89 versus the DNS standard mean ocean water. In other words, the DH ratio increases by a factor of 2.2 pre to post-perihelion. This is significant. In the manuscript titled 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko, a Jupiter family comet with high DH ratio by Outlook et al. Published in Science. A DH ratio value of 5.3 times 10 to the minus 4 is reported, which is not consistent with previous Jupiter family of comets JFC data, strongly suggesting that the DH ratio of the Jupiter family of comets is highly heterogeneous. The cause of this high DH ratio is usually attributed to deuterium-enriched water ice in the protosolar nebula. Since this solar system formation is speculative, I will not elaborate on such explanation. However, a recent article by Yao and Yapis titled Dynamic Deuterium Enrichment in Cometary Water via Elie-Rideau Reactions, a different pathway for deuterium enrichment is proposed, namely the collision of holes with 10 to 15 electron volts and hyperthermal with 10 to 200 electron volts water ions against deuterium-enriched surfaces. The authors state water ions in the extended coma are accelerated toward the nucleus, where they collide with the outer nucleus crust of 67P, where the crust is dehydrated and includes typical cometary minerals such as olivine and pyroxene silicates and carbonaceous refractory minerals. Likewise, whole water ions moving away from the nucleus will collide with those particles in the extended coma, which have a chemical composition similar to that of the nucleus crust. The authors were able to demonstrate in the laboratory that silicon oxide and highly ordered graphite carbon absorbs deuterium atoms via the bombardment of heavy water ions, D2O+, for 30 minutes at 200 electron volts, resulting in the formation of H2DO+ cations. This chemical pathway proposed can reasonably be called water ion implantation on the surface of the nucleus, and it is based on observational facts, especially the reported presence of hyperthermal water ions in the vicinity of comet 67P, although less certain on the nature of deuterated surfaces on comets. The key concept is that electric fields lead the way for the chemical reaction. I did previously state that a great number of chemical compounds observed in the coma and surface of comets is being driven electrochemically by energy provided to electric fields, which accelerate ions to sufficient kinetic energy and collision angles to result in bond formation processes. Therefore, it is quite refreshing to see that other researchers are beginning to be comfortable with the idea that a great number of complex chemical reactions are being driven by chemical means in the absence of solar radiation and or high temperatures. Provided the data reported for comet Lovejoy indicating an increase in the DH ratio pre- and post-perihelion is subsequently validated, I would argue that such data is an indirect indication of the influence of the solar flux in the electrochemical formation of water and heavy water observed in the coma and nucleus of comets. It is well known that deuterium is synthesized in the atmospheres of stars, and this applies to the sun, which then ejects deuterium via the solar flux electric fields. As a comet approaches the sun to an increasing voltage gradient, it encounters a higher deuterium density, which translates to an increased electrochemical heavy water formation, providing an overall high DH ratio as a function of heliocentric distance. In summary, in this episode, I propose that heavy water formation is not necessarily the result, although it can be to some extent, of water implantation on deuterated surfaces, but rather a direct electrochemical process mediated by electric fields of concentrated deuterium containing the solar flux interacting with hydroxide ions originating from refractory minerals and carbonaceous materials found in dust grains in the coma, as well as on the surface of comets. The complex chemical reactions observed on comets and other cosmic bodies are very likely driven by chemical means at low temperatures and in the absence of solar radiation.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. New scientific reports are offering further confirmation of the importance of electrical processes in planetary geology. Scientists studying the mysterious sand dunes of the Saturnian moon Titan are reporting that electrostatic forces may play a significant role in configuring the dunes' puzzling shapes. What makes the dunes especially odd is that they frequently point in the opposite direction of Titan's prevailing winds. A Scientific American article reports the team's findings as follows. Some scientists are suggesting a shocking solution to these backward-facing drifts. They may be sculpted not only by wind, but also by electrostatic forces. A co-author of the paper, published in the journal Nature Geoscience, says of the findings, "Why do Titan's dunes look like they're going the wrong way, against the wind? One way to explain it is if the sands are sticky and don't move very much most of the time from the wind, which is what you'd expect if the sands were electrified, electrostatically charged and clumped together. It turns out the sands of Titan should be very susceptible to charging in a unique way." The scientists believe that a number of environmental factors on Titan, including the chemical composition of its soils, its low gravity, and its minimal exposure to sunlight all combine to produce extreme electrostatic clinging when the grains collide and produce electrostatic charge. On this series, we have long argued that electrostatic forces have shaped many puzzling dune-like features on various bodies in our solar system, including the frozen dunes of the dwarf planet Pluto and the dunes of the comet 67P. However, like the immense electrified dust devils that NASA scientists have identified on Mars, on Titan, investigators may be confusing cause and effect. What the scientists have not considered is that Titan's winds may themselves be an electrical phenomenon. Electric fields produce ionic winds, such as those found in air purifiers. And as repeatedly referenced on this series, experiments such as those seen here by Billy Elverton can produce dunes simply by applying electric fields to plates of dust and other materials. In fact, the same electrical effects that could produce Titan's sand dunes may also be responsible for other mysterious geological phenomena on the moon. Scientists were surprised to observe what they interpret as the movements of so-called putative lakes, canyons, and river valleys across the surface of Titan. NASA investigators believe that a portion of Titan's crust could be disconnected by subsurface liquids, causing surface features to, quote, slide around. But the theoretical oceans of subsurface liquids on Titan, like the Saturnian moon Enceladus, remain an unproven assumption. What is known is that the gas giant Saturn and its moons are connected by electrical currents, and these current systems may be responsible for numerous heretofore unresolved geological mysteries, including the so-called ice geysers on Enceladus. Thunderbolts Picture of the Day managing editor Stephen Smith writes in his 2014 article, Impressions of Titan. Titan is an electrically charged body that is constantly bombarded by intense ion beams from Saturn. It shares many characteristics with its cousin moons, Io and Europa, that orbit the planet Jupiter, a particle fountain from its poles, a toroid of charged particles in a sheath, and exchanges of massive electric charge. In a picture of the day about volcanoes on Io, the fact that the calderas have several, quote, hotspots moved by several kilometers in a few short months was attributed to the plasma beams that complete an electric circuit with the moon and Jupiter. Points where plasma discharges from Jupiter touch down on Io exhibit an intense glow. Similar electrical phenomena could be influencing Titan's geology. One similarity between Earth and Titan is that both planetary bodies have powerful polar winds that are said to, quote, pull gases from their atmospheres out into space. As noted in a recent Space News report, scientists have recently acknowledged that powerful electric fields play a role in the supersonic plasma jets recently discovered in Earth's upper atmosphere. On Titan and other planetary bodies, it is only reasonable to consider that electric fields may produce ionic winds, which creates sand dunes and other geological features that have proved very puzzling for planetary scientists. We also predict that these features will continue to be discovered on bodies such as comets and other airless worlds, which do not have the necessary atmospheres to produce mechanical winds. It is encouraging to see increasing discussions in scientific literature of electrostatic forces playing a significant role in planetary geology. But for now, these discussions emphasize the need for all of the space sciences to recognize the undeniable significance of electricity in nature. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to Thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. On this series, we have recently presented reports that challenge some of the bedrock beliefs about the history of our planet, our solar system, and the universe as a whole. When it comes to our own world, the fundamental belief system shaping all of modern geology and astronomy is uniformitarianism, or the notion that changes in nature happen incrementally over eons of time. It's the position of the Thunderbolts Project that evidence from increasingly fine data in numerous specialized fields only confirms the hypothesis of recent catastrophic events on our planet and in the inner solar system. In this episode, Bishop Nicholas Sykes explores the question, is our history far different from that which official science proposes?
My previous videos in this series have considered the serious possibility of the science of the modern schools being wrong in areas of cosmology and physics about such diverse topics and phenomena as black holes, the Oort cloud, the composition and genesis of comets, the model of magnetic reconnection, the way the sun and other stars are powered, and Einsteinian relativity, including its restriction of the speed of gravity to the supposed maximum possible speed of electromagnetic radiation in vacuum. Science, however, is a broad subject. Indeed, one might adduce from the above, and far from exhaustive catalogue of contradictions that my colleagues and I are claiming that the whole enterprise of science is flawed in principle. It is necessary to deny that deduction categorically. In my view, what we are claiming is that human intellectual and moral error have, especially during the last 100 years, brought about grave flaws in that intellectual structure that in the second decade of the 21st century is being presented in the schools and in the media as settled science. One basic mistake is to ignore the reality that any science may only be regarded meaningfully as settled, and only tentatively at that when its various theories continue to be open to being tested by experiment and observation. Any science theory claiming that further investigation into it is closed has by that claim unsettled itself. If some new observational or experimental discovery is considered to disturb what was formerly regarded as settled, then the true scientific method will seek to find further resources of observation or experimentation to investigate the issue. Too often one perceives those in their settled science castles pulling up the drawbridges as if new observations, experiments, and science models must be science's enemies, rather than having the possibilities of bringing health and renewal to the great structure of science and science education that our generation is called to bequeath to the future. One of the most long-standing such settled science castles is that model of the Earth's history that may be referred to as Lyellian uniformitarianism. Charles Lyell, 1797 to 1875, who preceded Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, and upon whose thought Darwin came to draw. Accepting, one supposes, the Newtonian impression of a solar system that had run like clockwork for all of history, laid down the view that whatever past changes had ever been brought about in nature would have been essentially no different than what was observable in the present. And it seemed obvious that in the present time, natural changes were slow. Lyell's model of natural change in course of time overtook older models of catastrophic change accepted by many researchers, and particularly by Georges Cuvier, 1769 to 1832. In more recent times, models of punctuated evolution have been proposed by Stephen Jay Gould and others, but the conditions driving such punctuation are still assumed to have occurred only in periods of time before humans existed. It is therefore by no means altogether surprising that the electric universe model, which envisages catastrophic changes not only before the advent of man, or even only in man's prehistory, but actually within the historical period, has found the drawbridges being drawn up against its advance into the halls of academia. Catastrophe that is long ago and far away is one thing, but the possibility of catastrophe within human history is quite another. Once we accept that, who knows what the geological clock might begin to reveal about our own history, or indeed suggest about the future. Notwithstanding all this, the model of Lyellian uniformitarianism, if we are prepared to be scientific about the matter, should, in the name of science, be subjected to fresh scrutiny. Might not the EU model, which does encompass recent catastrophic change, be a means of renewing the science of our current geological and evolutionary outlook? For the science story of our own day, sticking to a centuries-old uniformitarianism has given us the mantra of no natural catastrophes for billions of years. The electric universe account, on the other hand, tells that such catastrophes must have occurred even within the lifespan of humanity. Let us, at the very least, put the two accounts head to head, ponder the matter, and learn.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A groundbreaking new scientific report provides dramatic confirmation of our planet's dynamic electrical environment. and the Earth-Sun connection. Phys.org recently reported that the European Space Agency's SWARM mission has discovered, quote, supersonic plasma jets high up in our atmosphere that can push temperatures up to almost 10,000 degrees Celsius. Attempting to provide historical context for the discovery, the report states, the theory that there are huge electric currents powered by solar wind and guided through the ionosphere by Earth's magnetic field was postulated more than a century ago by Norwegian scientist Christian Birkeland. While much is known about these current systems, recent observations have revealed that they are associated with large electrical fields. In fact, in recent years, the term Birkeland current has appeared with increasing regularity in mainstream scientific literature. Today, Professor Donald Scott discusses his own original modeling of a Birkeland current structure, and he explores the significance of this new discovery from the electric universe perspective.
SWARM is a constellation of 3 satellites designed to look at the geomagnetic field of Earth. They wanted to put some decent sensors, better sensors than had ever been flown before, I guess, up and to investigate what exactly the properties of the Earth's geomagnetic field were. It's encouraging that this recent article about SWARM not only mentions the phrase Birkeland current several times, but it also talks about electric fields. Now, that's a word that almost never gets mentioned in the establishment literature, but it's getting to be fairly well known that electrical energy does indeed come from the sun to Earth in large tube-like conduits that have, over the years, become known as Birkeland currents. The establishment usually only talks about magnetic and gravitational fields, but the all-important term electric current usually has been missing. This latest SWARM article makes it appear that the establishment may have been quietly listening to our ideas. Now, of course, they're never going to give us credit for it. They will now claim that they discovered everything and they try to ignore the existence of our prior claims. But I think it's our duty to ourselves and actually to posterity to stake out those claims and say exactly what we have said in the past about things like Birkeland currents. I will say that my model, which I hasten to say is an extension of the work of some other folks such as Hannes Alfvén, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and Anthony Peratt, and a fellow by the name of Stig Lundquist, who actually started the work on this model back in 1950. That model predicts most, if not all, of what the SWARM release refers to as their discoveries. It makes me a little bit worried about whether they have ever heard of some of the people. Certainly they had never heard of me, but you think they might have heard of Hannes Alfvén and Tony Peratt, and of course Christian Birkeland. But anyway, in 2015, the scientific journal Progress in Physics published an article of mine in which I included a quantitative derivation of this model. I finished it off. Lindquist started it. I ended up developing the equations that describe the physical structure of the Birkeland current. Those equations must be interpreted to follow up on what those equations predict about what the model must look like. Lundquist, in spite of my giving him credit for coming up with some of those equations, he never, like I guess most mathematicians don't, interpreted what those equations predicted for what the Birkeland current would look like and how it would act. But the model, as I developed it, shows the presence of electrical currents that flow in spiral paths in opposite directions. Those things were in that SWARM article. Oppositely directed currents, yes. And the Birkeland current itself is made up of a set of, and this is, I think, the important point, the Birkeland current is a set of concentric counter-rotating cylinders of electrical current and magnetic fields. And the currents and the fields are at all points in those Birkeland currents parallel, they're aligned. When you align the currents with the magnetic fields, the internal stresses on the Birkeland current relax and go to zero. And that's the single property that makes those Birkeland currents able to go over tremendous distances. I mean, we know they go from the sun to the Earth, and that's 93 million miles. Well, that's nothing. That's a child's footstep compared to the astronomical distances in light years some of these so-called jets from galaxies extend over, and those currents don't come apart. They don't spread out like a garden hose will end up in a bunch of droplets sprinkling over your lawn. They hang right together in collinear alignment, and that's the reason they do. The formal name for a Birkeland current really is a field-aligned current. It's a force-free current because the fields are aligned. Anyhow, the Swarm article says each satellite has an electric field instrument positioned at the front to measure plasma density, drift, and velocity. Well, if that's indeed the truth, then I would think they should have measured some kind of concentric counter-rotation, because the counter-rotation is the prime property, as far as I'm concerned, of the Birkeland current. But either they haven't observed it, or if they did observe it, they have neglected to mention it, maybe because they don't know why it occurs. It's well known that the Earth has a geomagnetic field. It's less well known, but it's equally true that the Earth and many of the planets also have their own electric field. And the electric field that emanates either to or from Earth is a very powerful electric field. The Earth is, and most of the planets, I think, are also electrically charged. If you sit down and analyze what that phrase means, supersonic plasma jets, plasma is a word that defines a cloud-like collection of charges, plus ions, negative electrons, all going along or traveling along in a cloud-like formation. And a jet is a moving stream. It's a flow. So a flow of charge, well, that's the definition of an electric current. But we already knew this. That's what Birkeland himself, back in the early 1900s, said was going on. That's what they laughed at him for saying.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part one of this presentation, physicist Wal Thornhill began laying the foundations for a new theoretical understanding of our sun and all stars. Standard theory remains that stars are born due to the gravitational collapse of material in nebular clouds over vast spans of time. We're told that stars die when they inevitably exhaust their fuel or simply explode. But for many years, countless discoveries have contradicted these fundamental concepts. In this episode, Thornhill further explores the electric universe predictions and explanations for a variety of stellar phenomena.
So let's return to the declaration of our esteemed internet lecturer that our sun was born about 5 billion years ago. There is no evidence whatsoever for this categorical statement. With the thermonuclear model discredited by the observational evidence, the complex life story of stars is exposed as fiction. Two recent reports support this judgment out of a countless number of others expressing surprise at unexpected discoveries. On March 6th, phys.org headlined a report, "Star Clusters Discovery Could Upset the Astronomical Apple Cart." It begins, The discovery of young stars in old clusters could send scientists back to the drawing board, because models of stellar evolution are based on the assumption that stars within star clusters form from the same material at roughly the same time. However, back to the drawing board always means embroidering the set of beliefs permanently inscribed on the board. No physicist shows the intellectual integrity to wipe the board clean of its unscientific Big Bang myth and start afresh. It's all too hard and scary. So Dr. Kenji Becky from the International Center for Radio Astronomy Research says, the formation of these younger stars could have been fueled by gas entering the clusters from interstellar space. However, observations showed that there was no correlation between interstellar hydrogen gas and the location of the clusters we were studying. We believe the younger stars have actually been created out of the matter ejected from older stars as they die, which means we have discovered multiple generations of stars belonging to the same cluster. The words "we believe" are accurate. The discovery of multiple generations of stars is not. The notion of the age of a star is based on plotting a point on the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram where the star leaves the main sequence after the exhaustion of its main fuel. But we have shown that stars do not exhaust their fuel any more than an electric light does. Stars don't die because their fuel runs out or mysteriously explodes. The Hertzsprung-Russell diagram is simply a plot of points and not an evolutionary sequence. Stars have been observed to change swiftly and inexplicably from one location to another on the diagram. When viewed correctly as a mirror image, the diagram represents the change in color and brightness of a star as the electrical energy focused on it increases along the x-axis. Sharp discontinuities exist in experimental gas discharges between dark mode, glow mode, and arc mode. These discontinuities simply explain the sharply different appearances of faint white dwarfs, bright sun-like stars, and red so-called dwarfs and red giant stars. The red color is due to an extensive anode glow, and the faint white color is simply a coronal glow of a normally constituted stellar body lacking a bright arc mode photosphere. No imaginary ultra-dense dwarf object is required. There is no need to invent an ad hoc requirement for stars to have exploded and then somehow gather their widely scattering dust gravitationally to give birth to younger stars in the cluster. Stellar explosions are often invoked to clear dust and gas from star clusters. Astronomers can't have it both ways. But critically, none of this complicated ad hocery fits the observations of filamentary star birth inside molecular clouds. The second report appeared on May 18th last year in phys.org, titled Stellar Mystery Deepens. A Monash University-led research team made an unexpected discovery that a large group of stars are dying prematurely, challenging our accepted view of stellar evolution. Their results revealed that large numbers of helium-burning stars are dying prematurely in the M4 globular cluster. Professor Latanzio from the Max Planck Institute for Astrophysics said, globular clusters are some of the oldest objects in the universe. Although we have some ideas for what is going on in them, every time we look carefully, we find something unexpected. They are both fascinating and frustrating at the same time. The international team found that about half of the stars tend to skip the red giant phase, instead becoming white dwarfs millions of years ahead of schedule. Demonstrating once again what's wrong with the modern scientific method, characterized as shut up and simulate, Professor Latanzio continued, computer simulations do not agree with this observation. So, as well as continuing observations, new computer models will need to be generated to better understand what is taking place in the cores of these stars. But the computer models are built on missing or invalid concepts. There's nothing going on in the cores of stars, and globular clusters are not understood. So the mathematical computer simulations produce a virtual, unreal cosmos that, like the movies, can be programmed to produce anything you can imagine. And the artist's impressions we see in science reports are little more than glossy advertising material, but much more deceptive because it is falsely labeled real science. There is no real mystery here. With no nuclear fire inside, stars don't die by bloating to a red giant and collapsing to a white dwarf as their fire goes out. The life and death stories of stars are fictional. The bloated appearance of red giants is not due to internal pressure caused by hypothetical helium burning at 100 million degrees in the core of a star. It is a purely electrical effect witnessed in laboratory low-pressure gas discharge tubes. Red stars are those that satisfy their need for electrons from the surrounding plasma by expanding the surface area over which they collect electrons by growing a large plasma sheath that becomes the effective anode in space. The growth process is self-limiting because as the sheath expands, its electric field grows stronger. Electrons caught up in the field are accelerated until they become energetic enough to excite neutral particles they chance to collide with, and the huge sheath becomes a uniform red anode glow. It becomes a red giant star. The electric field driving this process will also give rise to a massive flow of positive ions away from the star, or in more conventional terms, a prodigious stellar wind. Such loss of matter is a characteristic feature of red giants. Standard stellar theory is at a loss to explain this since the star is said to be too cold to boil off a stellar wind. Arthur Eddington himself expressed his puzzlement about white dwarfs. Strange objects which persist in showing a type of spectrum entirely out of keeping with their luminosity may ultimately teach us more than a host which radiates according to rule. He was right. A white dwarf appears extremely hot, white, and underluminous because it is a faint white coronal discharge. As usual, a thin plasma sheath will be formed between the plasma of the star and the plasma of space. The electric field across the plasma sheath is capable of accelerating electrons to generate ultraviolet light and X-rays when they hit atoms in the atmosphere. And the power dissipated is capable of raising the temperature of a thin plasma layer to tens of thousands of degrees. The spectral lines are broadened, sometimes to the point of disappearance, due to the coronal electric field. This gives the misleading impression that hydrogen, whose spectral lines are smeared the most, is missing in many of these stars, and that therefore they are remnants of larger stars that have conventionally lost or burned their hydrogen fuel. So, globular clusters are not some of the oldest objects in the universe. Their spherical shape of a dense collection of stars and their elliptical orbits about the galactic center hint at a quasar-style birth process from the plasmoid at the heart of the galaxy. If so, the electromagnetic environment inside the globular cluster is different to that in open clusters of stars, so we should expect an unusual distribution of white dwarfs and red giant stars. And the puzzling observation that some globular cluster stars have 100 times more iron than others could also be explained by electromagnetic sorting of elements within the globular cluster at its birth. The fact we don't understand stars in the 21st century highlights what Arthur Koestler wrote in The Sleepwalkers. The history of cosmic theories in particular may without exaggeration be called a history of collective obsessions and controlled schizophrenia, and the manner in which some of the most important individual discoveries were arrived at reminds one more of a sleepwalker's performance than an electronic brain's. Science is still in its childhood, and we behave as infants. We give far too much credit to scientists for knowing what they are talking about.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part one of this presentation, Dr. Michael Claridge, a scientist on the Sapphire Project team, began his analysis of a recent landmark discovery which shows a surprising relationship between sunspots and solar flares. As Dr. Claridge explained, the discovery that solar flares seem to have a powerful influence on sunspots is highly problematic for standard solar theory. In this episode, Dr. Claridge explores what may be the fundamental difference between the standard and electric universe concepts of the sun. And that is, in an electric universe, stars are not the isolated bodies envisioned in standard theory.
Scientific thought exists in layers, or levels. At the top, we have theories. Below that, we have scientific models, and below that, we have data. I have stacked them vertically because these three aspects, theory, models, and data, are not of equal weight or equal power. Scientific theories, the top level, are what you might call big ideas. They set the overall framework for years of work where many scientists can create many models and do lots of experiments collecting lots of data. Scientific theories change very slowly, over centuries. The models change more quickly, and new data, it's coming in every day. I'm going to talk through some reasons why this new sunspot data is so important for our understanding of scientific theories and models. Current theory, and I want you to notice that I'm using the word theory, which is the highest level of my diagram, says that each star in our great universe is isolated from every other star. Yes, you may not know that about mainstream cosmology, but mainstream cosmology assumes that every star in our galaxy is isolated from every other star. Like our picture of a medieval lord, each isolated star creates its own energy only from within itself. But if you entertain the idea that stars might be energetically connected to each other, if you entertain the idea that stars might receive energy from the galaxy of which they are a part, just as cells in our own bodies receive sustenance from our bodies as a whole, then we have in our hands a very different scientific theory. We are at a point in cosmology where there are two worldviews. The old worldview, as I mentioned, sees all stars as energetically isolated. The new worldview says that stars are energetically connected and can influence each other. The new worldview goes further to acknowledge different levels of energies. There are energies that exist at planetary levels, like weather, lightning, and the northern lights. And then there are energies that operate at the scale of stars, solar flares, the solar wind, and the heliospheric current sheet. But there's also energies that operate at the level of galaxies. And all these levels are connected. In the new worldview, the planets receive solar energies and transform those or scale them down so that lightning and weather on our planet are manifestations of what happens when a planet absorbs and digests solar energies. And just as a planet would be blown to smithereens if it were hit by the full power of a star, so would a single star be blown to bits if it were to ever receive the full energy of a galaxy. But individual stars can absorb and digest their small portion of these galactic energies. The stellar activities of solar flares and sunspots, and the solar wind, are what happens when stars take in their small portion of galactic energies. Asked if there is any data that might support such a new worldview, I can only say that much of the evidence has already been seen, but we have not known how to understand what we are seeing. We scoff at people several hundred years ago who thought the earth was the center of all things. For a few hundred years now, we have been thinking in terms of the sun being the center of all things. So how are we really any better? It is time now to add another and larger level to our cosmology and truly see that stars are part of a larger, a more energetic world. Look, for example, at this wonderful image from the Herschel telescope. We can see clearly that stars form on filaments, galactic filaments. I can tell you that none of the models of the old worldview predicted that. In fact, such a result would have been impossible. Here's a situation similar to Chang Liu's paper. The old theories not only did not predict that stars would form this way, the old theories said it was impossible. Yet in the new cosmology that I'm trying to describe, this result of stars forming on threads was predicted by such theorists as Wal Thornhill long before the images started coming back from the Herschel telescope. He was able to predict exactly what the new telescopes show us because he was starting from a very different theory of how galaxies and stars are related. This infrared data from Herschel is just one example. Fresh images and data are coming in every day of our Earth, of other planets, solar system, and the planets that orbit other stars. When the recent results were published that a nearby star has 7 planets orbiting it, all of which might harbor life, I asked my students, are you surprised that we are discovering that most stars have planets orbiting them? And the vast majority of my students said no. They were not surprised at all. I was very encouraged by this because it shows that they have an inherent sense that these sorts of hierarchies are to be expected. Our solar system is not unusual or any sort of exception. And I encourage anyone out there to start looking at the wealth of the new data from NASA, ESA, and other agencies. Look at the data from the point of view of a new cosmology.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part 1 of this presentation, author Ted Holden explored the evidence for fundamental differences in our world's environment since a time when dinosaurs walked the Earth. In Holden's analysis, the most obvious explanation for the enormous size of the largest dinosaurs is that Earth's gravity was once considerably weaker. But the mysteries don't end there. While the Thunderbolts Project takes no position on these issues, in this episode, Holden continues his analysis and explores perhaps the most controversial question of all. Is it possible that dinosaurs existed on Earth far more recently than institutional science has ever considered?
Aside from the various problems I may have mentioned in that first interview, involving dinosaurs and flying creatures and things whose ability to function depends on something which involves a squared figure where its weight is always proportional to volume, which is the cubed figure. In the case of size and strength, as you double your dimensions, you cut your power to weight ratio in half. You can only cut your power to weight ratio in half so many times still stand up and function right. You've got a problem with the large dinosaurs, aside from just standing up, you've got a problem with what to do with their necks, right? Because, as I mentioned previously, if they held their necks upwards, they wouldn't be able to get blood to their brains, right? I mean, it would take a heart bigger than their body would hold just to get blood pressure enough to function, right? So that you've got people nowadays trying to believe that all dinosaurs hold their necks outwards, but a large dinosaur holding his neck outward would have an even bigger problem than that. In other words, something like a seismosaur, whose neck could easily be 50 feet long, right? Could easily weigh 40, 50, 60,000 pounds. If you've got a neck which is even 40,000 pounds, and if the center of gravity of that neck is even 10 feet out from the shoulders, then you're looking at 400,000 foot-pounds of torque. And you're probably looking at more like 500,000, a bit more than 500,000 foot-pounds of torque for a number of these animals if they were to hold their necks outwards. Now, what exactly is like 500,000 foot-pounds of torque ballpark for? Well, I mean, that's ballpark for the combined maximum torque of all 4 of the engines of an Iowa-class battleship. That is enough torque to drive a 60,000-ton ship through the water at 33 knots. That's the dilemma. A sauropod dinosaur in our world would have no way to hold his neck. He couldn't hold his neck upwards because of the blood pressure problem, and he couldn't hold his neck outwards because of the torque problem. You've got a couple of other comments on that first video. Some of these I've seen over and over again. You've got a claim that, well, maybe the air was simply more dense in those days, or you had an atmosphere which was close to being buoyant, and maybe that accounted for some of these problems. The answer is not really. I mean, number one, you've still got to breathe that air, right? I mean, air which was close to being buoyant would simply burn up anything trying to breathe it. It would be like the redneck physics experiment where you get the guys trying to pour a pail of liquid oxygen onto a barbecue. That looks sort of like the napalm bomb scenes, you know, for Victory at Sea. And that's what would be going on inside the cells of your body if you were to sit there and try to breathe an atmosphere that was that thick. That's number one. Number two says that, like, even in the case of a 40-pound pterosaur, like the pterodactyl, the pteranodon, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, that was the biggest flying dinosaur that anybody knew anything about, right? And they assumed that somewhere around 40 pounds was the largest creature that could possibly even glide, much less fly. Is that even just holding his wings in a turn would snap the wing bones if he was any bigger than that. Just in our normal atmosphere, enough to make the atmosphere close to being buoyant, and that problem becomes worse, not better. You've got problems which I think would just eliminate this idea of a vast and thicker atmosphere straight off the bat. The only thing that really helps the situation is reduced gravity. You've also got a question of people wanting to talk about expanding Earth theories. And I mentioned that I do not believe in Earth expanding theories. Why not, right? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Why would anybody want to believe in an expanding Earth theory? There's two reasons. One is dinosaurs. You know, once you realize that a large dinosaur does not exist in our present gravity, then the simplest way to try to account for reduced gravity in ancient times would be to try to talk about the Earth simply expanding its mass, right? Or maybe the Earth just was nowhere near as big in ancient times. You've got people making this claim, and they assume that you've got 65 million years to account for this increase in mass going from the world of the dinosaurs to our present age. It turns out that that's not really believable. It's like those 65 million years have gone away. Somewhere around 2006, you started getting soft tissue turning up in dinosaur remains. It started with this Mary Schweitzer at North Carolina State University, who was working with a bunch of tyrannosaur bones. They had one very large femur bone, which was intact. They cut it in half, right? They figured glue it back together once they got it back to the university. But once they cut this thing in half, they were able to see that there was soft tissue remaining in this bone, that they've gotten more and more soft tissue starting from that time, not just in the one bone, right, but in a number of dinosaur remains involving hadrosaurs, involving like the Triceratops, involving several other kinds of dinosaurs, right? And, you know, there's no way in the world that soft tissue is going to survive for 65 million years. Okay, they've actually started to get good radiocarbon dates for some of the soft tissue. In several cases, they've gotten radiocarbon dates of 20 to 40,000 years. So that you've got several data points like this. You've got radiocarbon datings for dinosaur remains. You've got good representations of known dinosaur types on canyon walls around North America. And the most common of the dinosaur petroglyphs is the stegosaur, which Native Americans called Mishu Pishu, which means water panther. You've got like a number of those which still exist. You've got a large animal that holds his legs underneath his body, which means that he's not a crocodile or anything like that, right? He's got dorsal spikes at the stegosaur. Now, Vine Deloria told me he'd been doing a compendium of Indian oral traditions. He'd been up and down the American continent speaking to every storyteller, every keeper of oral traditions, all the way from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego, right? And he said if there was anything that sort of flummoxed him at first, it was the extent to which almost every one of these tribes retained oral traditions about, Indian ancestors having to deal with dinosaurs. He said that the name Mishu Pishu means water panther. It's a name similar to the word Mississippi, that Indian oral traditions described this water panther, they call him a water panther, Mishu Pishu, as having like red fur, a cat-like face, a saw-blade back, and a great spiked tail, which he used as a weapon. Okay, Lewis and Clark had said that their native guides were in mortal terror at the sight of these glyphs around the Mississippi River, because the original intention of these glyphs was caution. One of these things lives here. What I believe to be the case, stegosaur was not the largest dinosaur, but he still had gravity problems, right? It was like, I believe that the stegosaur moved into water after the change in gravity simply to deal with this increase in weight, but that he didn't have any real adaptation for living in water. He eventually died out, the bull sharks got him or something else like that died, At the Kachina Bridge in Natural Bridges, Utah, you've got a sauropod glyph, which looks like this. But the evolutionists that are saying, well, this is just a snake, obviously, and these four legs are just smudges. No snake ever coiled itself into a configuration like that. That's a dinosaur.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. New reports in popular science media highlight some of the theoretical limitations in planetary science and geology today, limitations which have resulted in countless mysteries related to planets, moons, and comets. The reports in question propose that volcanism on various bodies throughout the solar system is more pervasive than scientists have ever previously believed, even supposedly occurring on comets. On March 6, 2017, Astronomy.com published the article, "Planetary Scientists Are Turning Up Volcanoes Everywhere They Look." The report focuses heavily on a theoretical phenomenon called cryovolcanism, or ice volcanoes. On planet Earth, scientists theorize that the shifting of tectonic plates is the cause of both earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. But on several other worlds which are not thought to have plate tectonics, planetary scientists believe they observe another type of volcanism, called cryovolcanism. A cryovolcano, or ice volcano, is hypothesized to result when gravitational forces produce tidal heating and other effects in an icy body, producing volcanic eruptions. For decades, planetary scientists have believed that tidal heating is the cause of the most dramatic volcanism in our entire solar system, on the Jovian moon Io. The Astronomy.com article outlines the hypothesis as follows. Io and other Galilean satellites, such as Europa and Ganymede, are in synchronous rotation around Jupiter. Io then becomes caught up in a tug of war between Jupiter's gravity and the gravity of these other satellites. This in turn leads to the bulging of Io's crust up and down, and the resulting friction produces a large amount of heat and a molten interior. When the pressure builds, it occasionally erupts melted rock and plumes of gas. However, as previously reported on this series, observations in recent years have effectively falsified the tidal heating model for Io's so-called volcanoes. In 2013, a geological survey found that the surprising locations of the plumes, quote, can't be reconciled with any existing solid body tidal heating model. But the problems for the volcano hypothesis on Io began almost immediately after their discovery. In fact, in 1979, it was the world-renowned astrophysicist Thomas Gold who first proposed that Io's so-called volcanic plumes were in fact high-energy electrical discharges. 9 years later, plasma scientist Anthony Peratt of Los Alamos Laboratories and co-author Alex Dessler also proposed an electrical mechanism for the, quote, plumes. If the plumes are in fact electrical discharges, this would account for numerous anomalies with the standard hypothesis, including their filamentary structure, a completely anomalous feature for any volcanic plume, as well as their surprising movements across the surface of Io. But perhaps most significantly, the electrical interpretation explains the electrical currents that have been found connecting the Jovian atmosphere and its icy moons. Planetary scientists insist that the source of the electrical currents is charged particles from volcanic eruptions. But this hypothesis was complicated when scientists also found the auroral footprints of the moons Europa and Ganymede. A research team wrote of this discovery. Europa is not thought to be volcanic. So what could produce the electrical current that zips along and eventually gives rise to Europa's auroral footprint? Similar problems also face planetary scientists who seek to explain the high-velocity features seen jetting from the Saturnian moon Enceladus. More than a decade ago, the discovery of the enormous jets and plumes at Saturn's south pole astonished scientists working on NASA's Cassini mission. Scientists had expected the moon to be geologically dead, and the last place they expected such activity would be the moon's south pole. As reported by Space.com at the time, the finding flipped everything scientists knew about Enceladus on its head, because what should have been a dead moon appeared to be geologically active, and what was supposed to be the moon's coldest region turned out to be its warmest. A co-investigator of the Cassini mission said of the discovery, "This is as astonishing as if we'd flown past Earth and found that Antarctica was warmer than the Sahara." The tiny moon is a mere 504 kilometers in diameter, and the icy plumes were seen to reach up to 480 kilometers high. Investigators settled on the notion that liquid water must be present under the surface like a Yellowstone geyser in order for it to erupt in high-speed jets. A NASA news release stated, "The rare occurrence of liquid water so near the surface raises many questions about this mysterious moon." But the immediate assumption of liquid water near the surface only showed that the surprising discovery caused no reassessment of a theoretical framework. Scientists settled on the notion that Saturn must be, quote, gravitationally kneading Enceladus, producing so-called cryovolcanoes at the moon's south pole through friction heating. In 2015, planetary scientists made the surprising discovery that particles in the Enceladus plumes are electrically charged. A lead investigator studying data from the Cassini plasma spectrometer said of the discovery, "What are particularly fascinating are the bursts of dust that CAPS detects when Cassini passes through the individual jets in the plume. Each jet is split according to charge, though. Negative grains are on one side and positive ones on the other. As in the Jovian system, we see an electrical connection between Saturn and Enceladus. The comparability of the gas giants' respective environments is summarized by Thunderbolts Picture of the Day managing editor Stephen Smith in his article, Enceladus is Plugged In. It's easiest to get an idea of what is happening on Enceladus by comparing it to another moon in the solar system, Jupiter's moon Io. Io acts like an electrical generator as it travels through Jupiter's plasmasphere, inducing over 400,000 volts across its diameter and more than 3 million amperes. That tremendous current flows along its magnetic field into the electric environment of Jupiter. The same kind of electromagnetic activity connects Enceladus with Saturn's poles. In the electric universe interpretation, neither the one-way electrical transaction scientists propose, nor the assumed charge neutrality of Jupiter, Saturn, and their respective moons can be valid. The electrical discharge activity that scientists misinterpret as cryovolcanism on Io and Enceladus may be comparable to the filamentary jets of comets, which are also electrical in nature. Ironically, in the March 2017 Astronomy.com report, "Are there volcanoes on comets?" the article suggests that so-called volcanic activity has occurred on comet 29P Schwarzmann-Bachmann in its orbit between Saturn and Jupiter. It states, "The strange activity may be due to the comet's unusually long day-night cycle. Unlike most comets, which rotate on hourly scales, 29P rotates only about once every 60 Earth days. During the comet's long night, material may pool in chambers beneath the surface. When the comet rotates into its long day, the gas expands, flexing the surface. High pressures can help the gas break through the surface, exploding outward in a volcano-like event. Instead of hot magma, frozen gas streams from the comet." However, neither the imagined subsurface cometary ice nor the theoretical nozzles from which comet jets supposedly emanate have ever been found. The 2012 paper, "Cometary Jet Collimation Without Physical Confinement," published in the American Geophysical Union, acknowledged the dilemma as follows. Contemporary models postulate that these jets collimate when the expanding gases and dust pass through a physical aperture or nozzle. However, recent high-resolution spacecraft observations fail to detect between cometary outbursts and dramatic solar activity. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. New reports in popular science media highlight some of the theoretical limitations in planetary science and geology today. Limitations which have resulted in countless mysteries related to planets, moons, and comets. The reports in question propose that volcanism on various bodies throughout the solar system is more pervasive than scientists have ever previously believed, even supposedly occurring on comets. On March 6, 2017, Astronomy.com published the article, "Planetary Scientists Are Turning Up Volcanoes Everywhere They Look." The report focuses heavily on a theoretical phenomenon called cryovolcanism, or ice volcanoes. On planet Earth, Scientists theorize that the shifting of tectonic plates is a cause of both earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. But on several other worlds which are not thought to have plate tectonics, planetary scientists believe they observe another type of volcanism, called cryovolcanism. A cryovolcano, or ice volcano, is hypothesized to result when gravitational forces produce tidal heating and other effects in an icy body, producing volcanic eruptions. For decades, planetary scientists have believed that tidal heating is the cause of the most dramatic volcanism in our entire solar system. On the Jovian moon, Io, the Astronomy.com article outlines the hypothesis as follows. Io and other Galilean satellites, such as Europa and Ganymede, are in synchronous rotation around Jupiter. Io then becomes caught up in a tug of war between Jupiter's gravity and the gravity of these other satellites. This in turn leads to the bulging of Io's crust up and down, and the resulting friction produces a large amount of heat and a molten interior. When the pressure builds, it occasionally erupts melted rock and plumes of gas. However, as previously reported on this series, observations in recent years have effectively falsified the tidal heating model for Io's so-called volcanoes. In 2013, a geological survey found that the surprising locations of the plumes, quote, can't be reconciled with any existing solid body tidal heating model. But the problems for the volcano hypothesis on Io began almost immediately after their discovery. In fact, in 1979, it was the world-renowned astrophysicist Thomas Gold who first proposed that Io's so-called volcanic plumes were in fact high-energy electrical discharges. 9 years later, plasma scientist Anthony Pratt of Los Alamos Laboratories and co-author Alex Dessler also proposed an electrical mechanism for the, quote, plumes. If the plumes are in fact electrical discharges, this would account for numerous anomalies with the standard hypothesis, including their filamentary structure, a completely anomalous feature for any volcanic plume, as well as their surprising movements across the surface of Io. But perhaps most significantly, the electrical interpretation explains the electrical currents that have been found connecting the Jovian atmosphere and its icy moons. Planetary scientists insist that the source of the electrical currents is charged particles from volcanic eruptions. But this hypothesis was complicated when scientists also found the auroral footprints of the moons Europa and Ganymede. A research team wrote of this discovery. Europa is not thought to be volcanic. So what could produce the electrical current that zips along and eventually gives rise to Europa's auroral footprint? Similar problems also face planetary scientists who seek to explain the high-velocity features seen jetting from the Saturnian moon Enceladus. More than a decade ago, the discovery of the enormous jets and plumes at Saturn's South Pole astonished scientists working on NASA's Cassini mission. Scientists had expected the moon to be geologically dead, and the last place they expected such activity would be the moon's south pole. As reported by Space.com at the time, the finding flipped everything scientists knew about Enceladus on its head, because what should have been a dead moon appeared to be geologically active, and what was supposed to be the moon's coldest region turned out to be its warmest. A co-investigator of the Cassini mission said of the discovery, "This is as astonishing as if we'd flown past Earth and found that Antarctica was warmer than the Sahara." The tiny moon is a mere 504 kilometers in diameter, and the icy plumes were seen to reach up to 480 kilometers high. Investigators settled on the notion that liquid water must be present under the surface like a Yellowstone geyser in order for it to erupt in high-speed jets. A NASA news release stated, "The rare occurrence of liquid water so near the surface raises many questions about this mysterious moon." But the immediate assumption of liquid water near the surface only showed that the surprising discovery caused no reassessment of a theoretical framework. Scientists settled on the notion that Saturn must be, quote, gravitationally kneading Enceladus, producing so-called cryovolcanoes at the moon's south pole through friction heating. In 2015, planetary scientists made the surprising discovery that particles in the Enceladus plumes are electrically charged. A lead investigator studying data from the Cassini plasma spectrometer said of the discovery, "What are particularly fascinating are the bursts of dust that CAPS detects when Cassini passes through the individual jets in the plume. Each jet is split according to charge, though. Negative grains are on one side and positive ones on the other. As in the Jovian system, We see an electrical connection between Saturn and Enceladus. The comparability of the gas giants' respective environments is summarized by Thunderbolts Picture of the Day managing editor Stephen Smith in his article, Enceladus is Plugged In. It's easiest to get an idea of what is happening on Enceladus by comparing it to another moon in the solar system, Jupiter's moon Io. Io acts like an electrical generator as it travels through Jupiter's plasmasphere, inducing over 400,000 volts across its diameter and more than 3 million amperes. That tremendous current flows along its magnetic field into the electric environment of Jupiter. The same kind of electromagnetic activity connects Enceladus with Saturn's poles. In the electric universe interpretation, neither the one-way electrical transaction scientists propose, nor the assumed charge neutrality of Jupiter, Saturn, and their respective moons can be valid. The electrical discharge activity that scientists misinterpret as cryovolcanism on Io and Enceladus may be comparable to the filamentary jets of comets, which are also electrical in nature. Ironically,